Hi everybody and welcome to the third Vassals of Kingsgrave podcast about the Lord of the Rings books. And today we're discussing book 3, which is the first of the two books in the second novel, which sounds really confusing. But basically it's all about Orcs and Uruk-Hai and Ents and Rohan, which is all wonderful stuff. And we have a fellowship of 8 podcasters today. So I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves. And I'm just going to run through by Skype names, but if everyone can say who they are on the forums, that would be awesome. So to start off, we have Amanda.
All right, I'm MiddleCyclone on the forums.
Do you just want to explain what your forum name, like the derivation of it? Because it's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's from a Nico Case album, actually. It's one of her, she's a indie singer-songwriter person.
Awesome. I love Nico Case.
Cool.
Sorry.
No, that's good, because you're actually the next person on my Skype list, so you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay, hi, I'm Matt, or Eiffel on the forums.
Awesome, and then on to Nadia.
Hi everyone, I am Nadia of the forums.
No, Nadia is the Sam of BOK, so she has the most easy to remember forum name and name. And next is Peter.
Oh, hi, this is Peter. I'm Shellfish on the forums.
And on to Whiteraven.
Hey, this is Brett.
And finally, last but not least, Joanna.
Hello, I'm Joanna, or Jo, really, if you want to call me that, JoThirteen on the forum.
So before we get into discussion of the book, it would just be cool, I think, to start with Amanda, then Joanna, talk about, you know, are you massive fans of Tolkien? Have you read all the extra stuff like the Silmarillion? Just which is your favorite bit of the book?
All right, I guess I'll start first.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I originally got into Tolkien's books because when I was really young, my dad actually read to me The Hobbit. And then I got eventually bored because it was taking too long for him to read it because it was really slow, and I ended up reading it on my own. And then I read Lord of the Rings and the other books. I've read the Silmarillion. I haven't read Children of Hurin, but I've been thinking about it. Because apparently it's really good. But I just haven't gotten around to it. I'm one of those weird people that really likes the Silmarillion. Because I find all the stuff with, like, the elves just doing terrible things to the world very interesting, actually.
Cool. So you're going to have a good, solid knowledge, because we're missing our Tedard elvish knowledge, so we can look to you for that. That's brilliant. And Joanna, how about you? How did you get into the books?
My aunt had the books on her car when I was like 9 years old, and then I had a broken leg, so I was really bored and decided to read them, and then she gave me the book for my birthday after that, and the Hobbit too, and I read them all very short time. But
the classic speed read. And which is your favorite bit or favorite book?
I really like the Silmarillion, like them, and I only read it very recently, a year ago or so, because it's harder to find here. So, but it's really interesting. I was able to read it even with all the names and that. It was a very interesting read.
Fantastic. So I'm definitely the person who's read the least on the podcast.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that one.
Nadia and I bringing up the rear with a shocking lack of knowledge. Okay, so we've got a lot to cover this week, so we should just push on, I think, with the chapter rereads. But before that, I just wanted to give like my key stats, because I'm a stato person, that basically book 1 of Lord of the Rings covers 17 years. Book 2 covers 3 months, but this book only covers 10 days. So Tolkien's really getting going with the story here. And we get the riders, we get the Uruk-Hai, we get the Ents, and we get Saruman. And we also get a real interlacing of the different story arcs. And so just to explain to listeners, before we've literally just gone through the chapters one by one. But I, in my kind of slightly amateur gonzo way, decided to split the chapters slightly differently to keep the kind of the POVs in a way, to keep with Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, and then switch to Merry and Pippin. So we'll see how it goes. So really, it's over to JoThirteen, who I think is going to take us wandering through Rohan for chapter 1. Do you want to just kick off with a bit of a summary, then we can get going to discuss the chapter?
Okay, I have the summary here that I wrote like 10 minutes ago.
Fantastic.
While trying to figure out what happened to the missing hobbits, Aragorn hears the sound of Boromir's horn. Realizing he's being attacked, he runs to help him, but arrives too late. he finds Boromir dying and surrounded by dozens of dead orcs. Boromir manages to tell him that the hobbits have been taken by orcs, and then asks him to save his people because he has failed. Then he dies before being able to tell Aragorn anything else about the whereabouts of Frodo and Sam, and so he is unsure if they were the hobbits taken away. Then Legolas and Gimli return, and they decide to build a cairn for Boromir. And while searching for weapons to place next to his body, Aragorn finds the hobbit's knife. They also find the bodies of creatures none of them had seen before, and Gimli thinks those were part of Sauron's army. But Legolas and Aragorn realize they're actually part of Saruman's army because of the white S they notice on their armor. Then they place Boromir's body on the cairn with his helm, the horn, and the sword next to him. They release it to the river, and the three of them briefly sing their farewell to Boromir. Afterwards, Aragorn, who had realized one of the boats was missing, finds some footprints and deduces Frodo went to Mordor and Sam went with him. And then, since they know they can no longer do anything to help them, they decide to leave and start hunt for the orc. That's pretty much all I wrote.
That's perfect, thanks.
Well, I think you said this on the last podcast, Bina, that this sort of feels very much that it should have been at the end of the book 2, I guess, end of the Fellowship of the Ring, and indeed they did do that in the films.
Yeah, it's really weird to me. I mean, yeah, I agree. It's a bit George R. R. Martin with Dance of Dragons, where certain bits get left out and you don't really understand why.
You should have gone with a cliffhanger, Song of Ice and Fire style in the first.
Maybe it's because Tolkien wanted to end with the ring, so with Sam and Frodo. But I still don't understand why he couldn't have had this burial and then Sam and Frodo. Well, I suppose, yeah, because then they can't go back and realize they've gone. So maybe that's the reasoning.
It's a really short chapter. He could have included. Not really.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because it makes the Two Towers start in like total chaos because of Aragorn and everyone just trying to figure out what's going on, and so it just starts with like a clear action of like them searching for what they should be doing and then finding direction.
Actually, yeah, that's kind of a good point, Amanda, and I do think there's definitely a shift when we get to these new chapters in the new book of Aragorn kind of being really in self-doubt and my decisions suck and I don't know what to do, and there is something to having this chaos and trying to figure out what's going on and keeping it in this book.
He even starts thinking that Gandalf was wrong in trusting him. You can see that in this first chapter even. He starts having doubts.
True.
So I guess it's the first time that we see the Uruk-Hai, or they sort of see that this is like a new breed of orc here. I guess in the movies they made the Uruk-Hai to be these like huge, like maybe like a head taller than a man, these like monsters, sort of like implacable, sort of like they didn't know any fear or anything like that. But actually in the books I think they're called goblin men. They're half orc and half human. Saruman has been sort of breeding them in Isengard, and they are shorter than humans in the books, but they're still sort of, I guess their main advantage is that they can withstand daylight, which normal orcs can't.
Do we ever know how he made that possible? Because that's huge, isn't it?
No, but it's horrifying to think about.
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes down to also, like, we never find out how the orcs were actually made, whether they're, damaged elves that were tortured to become orcs, or if they were actually created. So I think there's a huge question just in general about how orcs are developed and everything.
But you get that in the Silmarillion about how orcs were created.
Yeah, and how did you...
So in the Silmarillion, what does it say? Because I thought it was...
I think it's basically that they took the orcs, torture and maybe dark magic. They twisted the elves so that they became orcs eventually.
That's right.
Because Morgoth can't create things. He can only twist
Yes.
things that are...
Well,
He
he can
also-
create things. He can't create things that breed, though.
That's more accurate.
Some other things that he has created are dragons and trolls, I think. I think Treebeard actually says that trolls were sort of the enemy's answer to Ents, that they're sort of made of stone instead of wood. I guess that's sort of that they're not living per se, as they turn to stone in the daylight.
It's really unclear how they created dragons, because if you read the Silmarillion, that then they mention the first dragon, and no one knows where the dragons really came from. At least with the orc, you have that little bit of the text that shows it.
Yeah, and there's also the fell beasts that the Nazgul ride. Those are sort of also read by, I guess in this case, Sauron, but there's definitely a lot of that sort of going on, like they make monsters somewhere.
I mean, I would just put this stupid question down, like, why does Aragorn, like, Tolkien specifically says that Aragorn keeps Boromir's confession secret. And why is that? Is that just because he wants to be nice, or is there some deeper reason?
Well, probably to keep Legolas from talking shit about men.
I think it was because he already...
Oh, sorry. I think Boromir had such a really good reputation that if you were to start saying, that Boromir got twisted, you could put doubt into pretty much any man. If you've got a hero, you kind of want to make everyone believe that he's still a hero and that he died heroically.
I think it was because he already kind of made up for what he did wrong by protecting the other hobbits.
Which is fair enough, but all I would say is that as we go through these chapters, there is a sort of a certain trait of douchiness.
Did Martin say something about that?
Martin?
Oh, never mind. Sorry.
There is just a certain element by which, all the way through this particular book, as I was doing like a flash reread, certain people withhold certain bits of information. This isn't the most egregious example, but where you just think, why? Like, why not just be more forthcoming?
Their idea of planning is like the Doran Martell song. They never tell anyone anything.
Cool. But with that, if no one's got anything more to say on chapter 1, we can go on to chapter 2, if you like.
Briefly, I'd like to say that I think actually prefer the movie version of this scene to the book, actually. The sort of, in the book, Boromir just sort of dies, like, before saying anything. In the movie, the Boromir sort of despairs, and then Aragorn is able to sort of get his spirits up one last time, sort of, so he can sort of die hopeful, I guess. So, much better scene in the movie, in my opinion.
The death of Boromir, his final redemption when he does try and save the hobbits and the burial, I just think is really moving. And actually, the only other thing I wanted to mention on chapter 1 is I love how when they find all the stuff that the hobbits, or that have been stripped from the hobbits that have been taken prisoner, Aragorn comments that they've left all their beautiful sort of bits of weaponry and stuff that they sense that these are from Westerness and have some sort of anti-Mordor magics woven into them, so they want to keep a wide berth from them, which I think is a really nice observation. With that, on to chapter 2.
Okay, so chapter 2, our group of 3 continue running, and so they're running through the area, and they were able to stop, and they find some corpse of orcs, and that's one of the reasons, and they find out these are mostly not Saruman's orcs, they're not the Uruk-Hai, but they're other kinds of orcs, and so they start to think that there might be some dissension in the ranks, which we find out later on. We also get the first mention of the eagle that Legolas sees. Aragorn finds what he thinks is Pippin's leaf brooch, and he's able to then realize that maybe Pippin, at least Pippin is alive. And so in that first day, then they run 12 leagues, which is about 36 miles, which is one of the things I've always thought was really impressive about this book and these guys.
How much ground they cover?
How much ground they cover. When I was a kid reading this, I always thought it was really interesting because I was like, "There's no way, anyone could do that." And so at this point, night falls, and Aragorn continues doubting himself. He says he's an ill chooser. He doesn't know if he should run, if they should go during the night, or if they should stop and rest, because they know the orcs will continue to run at night. They are afraid that they've already come across 2 things in the day. They don't, and they're worried that they'll miss something if they continue on in the darkness. So they stop, they sleep. Legolas just walks around. Apparently, looking at the stars is enough to refresh him. And then they wake up. On the second day, Aragorn listens to the ground, hears horses, and he hears a lot of running. So then they take off and they start running again. And during this time, they're only sustained by the limbus that they received in Lothlorien. They continue going, and by the end of that second day, you can see that they're starting to struggle. Aragorn's walking. Gimli's described as his back's broken, but Legolas, ever the wonderful elf, he's, sustained. He keeps running. He keeps running ahead and running back. There's this really interesting line how it talks about how Legolas can sleep while he's running, but it's not even sleep really. It's more, just that's what men would call it.
I can see that Peter's elf cynicism is contagious.
I wanted to throw it in there, just during one of their breaks, Aragorn begins explaining the Rohirrim. He talks about how they're not men from Rohan, they're actually from the north, so they're more like the Bjornings, and that they're proud people. And it's a very, very long set of lines and everything. And I think, at least I've always loved the Rohirrim, and in finding the Tolkien fandom online, it seems like I'm not the only person who appreciates the Rohirrim. They're proud and willful, but they're true-hearted, generous in thought and deed, bold but not cruel, wise but unlearned, writing no books but singing many songs. I think that description and then later on everything that we read about them, Rohirrim are definitely one of the more interesting cultures in the entire thing.
Cool, the horse lost, I guess the sort of like the Dothraki without all the rape and pillaging.
Yeah, I guess just a little bit more noble. I mean, I don't know.
They're sort of Anglo-Saxon sort of Vikings on horses and not sort of like Mongols and Native Americans like the Dothraki, but they definitely have that sort of like proud warrior people, but that's like a positive thing here.
Right. I definitely think that when they do the whole circling the wagons thing, that's very Comanche when they all, and you definitely get that in the movie.
So as Aragorn explains who they are, they see a large amount of horsemen approach them, and they hide. They're hidden well by the cloaks that Galadriel was given to them, and the horsemen actually ride completely past them, and it isn't until Aragorn stands up and calls out to them that they see him, and they do that Comanche ride around that Bina was talking about. They meet Eomer. All of the groups are very stuck up almost. No one is willing to tell who each other is. I believe it's Aragorn mentions that they went through Lothlorien, and Eomer kind of derides upon Galadriel, and Gimli steps up and, kind of does a standoff with him. They're
all so cocky and alpha male there, and you just think, to a certain extent, this is Eomer's land, so it behooves Aragorn to just say who the frack he is. I mean, this is a time of war. You're cockily walking through someone else's land, and you're not going to tell him who you are. I'm just going to be all mysterious.
It isn't until Aragorn pulls out the Narsil that everyone kind of calms down and everyone sees him. And Aragorn goes through one of those traditional, changes that Tolkien has him go through when he pulls out his sword. After that, everyone calms down. Eomer explains to the group that they had been hunting orcs. They had asked about hobbits. No one had seen any, but he didn't even know what hobbits really were. Eomer talks about how Gandalf isn't welcome in Rohan anymore. Then he learns of Boromir. The Fellowship realizes that they've been running now for 4 days, and the total amount comes out to 45 leagues, which is about 135 miles. Which, I mean,
it's not possible, right?
It's not possible. I've hiked the Appalachian Trail, and when I was booking it, it was about 20 miles. It was about 20 miles a day, and these guys were going 3 times that. So yeah, it's just really impressive. And I always remember as a kid being like, man, one day when I grow up, maybe I'll run as fast as these guys. Eomer then talks about how a treaty of Sauron has come, but Rohan did not listen to him, and then Sauron stole their black horses, which I assume were the horses that the 9 riders were riding.
Yeah, I think so.
Then they are also saying that they're starting to fight Saruman on their eastern side as well. He warns of a white wizard that looks like Gandalf that's been seen in the Fangorn Forest area. Then Éomer gives the Fellowship...
Actually, can I just ask a question before we move on to Éomer? Do you guys think that Saruman Dwimmercrafty, I love that phrase, is deliberately trying to look like Gandalf? Or do you think it's just coincidence? Do you think he's kind of playing it up just to mess with people?
I think it might be the other way around, like that Gandalf the White, or Gandalf actually sort of looks like Saruman as he should have been. I think he actually says that. I guess Saruman hasn't done that sort of like wandering thing, at least in a long time. I guess he's sort of like putting the old man disguise on now when he's spying on the camp there.
Oh, okay, cool. Sorry, Matt.
I'd never even thought about that maybe Saruman was trying to look like. And so Éomer lets the Fellowship go, and he gives them horses that from riders from those orcs that they had fought. At that point, we get the standard Gimli's a dwarf, and he doesn't ride horses, so he rides with Legolas, and then they take off to the Orc pit. And then pretty much the rest of that chapter is mostly about gossiping about Fangorn. It's too dark, really, to look around where the Rohirrim fought the orcs. As they're about to go to sleep, Gimli has the first watch, and Gimli sees an old man, cries out. At that point, they realize their horses are gone, and chapter 2 ends.
So I just wanted to say I love it. I don't know how you pronounce these names. Is it Eothane? Eothan? I love how Éomer's like, finally, okay, I'm going to give these guys some horses. And I love how independent the men of Rohan are. Like, they're not as bureaucratic and hidebound as Gondor. So his sidekick, Eothane's like, you sure, dude? Because, that's not really allowed. And then he's like, fine, we can give like these men some horses, but are we really going to give a horse to a dwarf? Like, that's just like so beyond the pale. Yeah. So I think that's a good detail. But I think there is something to the idea that in Rohan people are more independent, and you are allowed to you see that with Hama later, that you're allowed to question your betters.
Why is it that Gimli's okay riding bitch, but he doesn't want his own horse?
Yeah.
He doesn't want to cut off, he's got an axe. He doesn't want to cut off a horse's head by accident, not to get dark.
Like a Godfather moment.
I don't think he told Legolas that. He's like, I might cut your head off, Legolas. I'm sorry. I just don't want to kill the horse.
Yeah, well, he's a dwarf. He probably rates horses higher than elves anyway.
Maybe. Oh, I like at the beginning of this chapter when they come upon the orcs that are all dead, and Aragorn calls it a debate. Like, he was just like, they had some kind of debate here, and there was just like a whole bunch of dead orcs. It doesn't really seem like they talked about much.
It's like wonderful deadpanning from it's like one of the few times he's funny. He's a bit like Stannis, isn't he? He's very earnest. We never see Aragorn really crack a joke.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting, this chapter in general, that they're sort of chasing these orcs, and later on we find out that the orcs were like, at least 100 of them were left after some of them actually sort of ran off. So it was like there were 3 guys were chasing hundreds of orcs, and what were they going to do with them if they caught them? I mean, it's like a dog chasing a car.
Yeah, Éomer says that when Aragorn says that he's been hunting orcs, and Éomer's like, well, you guys are completely unsuited to do this. It took my entire 3rd mark to take these guys down.
And then Aragorn showed him Narsil and said, but you didn't have this.
But there's so many moments in this book, right, where Tolkien sets it up that Aragorn's a little bit douchey, but then kind of then pisses people off and then has to show his sword to kind of prove who he is. I find it quite comedic.
It's also kind of interesting that, like, the sword, granted this isn't a lot of fantasy stuff, it's just that, if you're able to pull out this sword, everyone's like, oh, wow, look at that sword. Oh, you must be sure. Like, if you had seen that, like, I could easily see, him pulling out the sword, and he's like, I am the king and everything, and then they just look at him, it's like, that's a nice looking sword, but, that doesn't mean...
Yeah, and you could have just nicked that sword from someone just because you wield a sword doesn't prove that you're anybody at all.
It was just forged.
I'm gonna, as a fan of swords, I think I read somewhere in the Fellowship of the Ring actually beforehand that this sounds something almost like from King Arthur or something, that if somebody that's not of Elendil's bloodline were to like grasp Narsil or Anduril, they would sort of die straight away or something like that.
Really?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I read that.
Wow, so it's a bit like Excalibur then.
Yeah, what was that? It was like a chair that nobody could sit in but like the purest knight or something in King Arthur.
Well, that's like the Iron Throne, and we all know that the wrong Queen sat next, she had blood dripping from her thighs. The only other thing I wanted to say about this chapter is because this is meant to be the part of England that I'm from, which is kind of cool. And it's kind of weird how England does have this kind of flat area that's perfect for horses, but we don't really have a word in native English like prairie or savannah, because historically the Anglo-Saxons were basically really, really, really scared of horses. Like, they had this almost like pathological superstition about riding horses, which is why they get their ass kicked by the Normans in 1066 and got invaded. But all these words like Theoden, Thengel, Folkwine, etc. are all basically just synonyms for king. So basically all the kings in Rohan are called King, which is really dumb. Apart from Eorl, which means Earl. So he was kind of like the first kind of guy who was just a lord or old warrior, which is what Eorl, if that's how you pronounce it, means. And then he kind of made himself a king, and then everyone else is just called king. So anyway, little bit of, because I have so much shocking lack of knowledge, I just thought I'd just throw in that geeky knowledge in
Isn't
at that
there
point.
the sigil of Rohan is a white horse on a green field? Isn't there like a hill somewhere in England that there's like a big sort of like a horse on the hill there?
We have Sutton Hoo, so we have a lot of these,
it's on a large scale. There's this.
Oh yeah, we have the chalk horse that's kind of imprinted on the hill. But that's more like where I now live, actually, in Surrey. But in this area of East Anglia, which is the Mercia, which is the mark, we have all these burial grounds that are very Rohanish. So yeah, there's lots of it's very similar to that kind of culture.
Oh, their cairns, rather? Like the stone burials? I think it's with Rohan, too. They bury them under stone. I would have to check, though.
Okay, so moving on to Chapter 5. So in Chapter 5, titled The White Rider, we have Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli sitting around, and they start talking about the old man that Gimli saw. One of the things that was interesting is that this old man that Gimli saw had a hat and not a hood. And the one that Éomer warned them about was wearing a hood, and that was like a major source of contention. Then dawn comes, and the three begin to search the battlefield where the Rohirrim were fighting the Orcs. Aragorn is able to find a Malorn leaf, which is the leaves that were covering the limbus that they received in Lothlorien. And they also find crumbs in the area. I thought it was really interesting that Aragorn's, trying to figure this out. He's very CSI-like, finds all this stuff. And then he looks at it and he says, well, this has to mean, one of the hobbits are alive, because a hobbit would sit down during battle and eat. So at that point, they follow the tracks for the hobbits. They realize that there are two sets of tracks, so that they're going to... So they think Merry and Pippin are both alive. And as they go into the forest, it's described as very dark. It's very foreboding. Legolas, he says he feels very young in the forest, even though he's very old. And this is the first time I think that it's mentioned how old Legolas actually is, And maybe that's kind of the movie penetrating our perception and everything. But I always seen, Legolas always seems like this young hothead. But since he's an elf, he's actually very, very old. And then they eventually come up to this hill with a rock wall, and they climb the rock wall and look out across the area. And at that point, Legolas sees an old man, similar to what Gimli saw the previous night. Gimli urges Legolas to shoot at the man with his bow, but when Legolas draws his arrow, he's unable to release, so he just refuses to release, and he puts down his bow. At that point, the old man approaches them, and he asks Legolas to put away the bow, and at that point, Legolas actually drops the bow. And I thought this was all really interesting because I think this explains magic in Tolkien's world. It's more about buffs and enchantments and less about actual active spells and attacks. A magician is protected by the ability to make people not harm him and not to protect himself from harm. And then at that point, they ask for his name, and he says, have you not guessed my name already? Don't you know who I am? He sits down, and when he sits down, they can see white underneath his cloaks. Gimli says that it's Saruman. They all draw their weapons, and the old man stands up, takes off his cloak, and raises his staff. That's when Aragorn drops his sword because it becomes hot, and Gimli just stands there frozen. Legolas shoots an arrow, but it bursts into flame and everything. Which is a scene I thought was really well done in the movie.
Yeah, I agree. It was pretty boss. It was really nicely done.
Yeah, and especially how they sort of interwove Christopher Lee's voice with Ian McKellen's there. It's
one of the few times when I think the withholding of information, like Gandalf almost like slightly testing them, like, can you see through to who I am, is actually really good. It's not just pointless.
And so at that point, Legolas realizes who it is. He, says his name, Mithrandir. Aragorn wakes up kind of from a sleep. He says he stirs, and he says, Gandalf, I can't believe this. What veil was over my sight, Gandalf? And the old man says, Gandalf, yes, that was my name. I was Gandalf. But you may still call me Gandalf. And I thought this was really interesting, and we can talk about his transformation and everything. Because later on Gimli says, Gandalf, you are all in white. And he says, yes, I am white now. Indeed, I am Saruman. One might almost say Saruman as he should have been. This kind of goes to, the role of the Astari, which, Saruman and Gandalf, the two blue wizards, Radagast were, and the roles that they were supposed to play. Gandalf explains that the eagle that Legolas has been seeing over the past couple days was his friend Gwahir, I'm sure I said that wrong, the Windlord, who was the one that rescued him from Orthanc back from the story that was told back in Rivendell. And he also talks about how the hobbits are in the forest, and they are the ones that have talked to Treebeard, and they've started an avalanche. He starts talking, and Aragorn says that, he's speaking in riddles, and he said, no, I was just talking aloud to myself, a habit of the old, where they choose the wisest person present to speak to. Gandalf's pretty much saying
that you guys are idiots.
Yeah.
So are you saying that at this point Gandalf knows that Merry and Pippin have been successful in rousing the trees and the Ents, sorry? Because if not, his decision to then leave Fangorn and just head straight to Theoden is kind of weird.
I think because, they say they were brought to Fangorn, and their coming was like the fall of small stones that starts an avalanche in the mountains. And even as we talk here, I hear the first rumblings. And that Saruman had best not be caught away from home when the dam bursts. I took that as, we've already gone through the Treebeard chapters. This is chapter 5. Gandalf knows what's going on. And maybe later on when he says, they have to leave, that Treebeard will take care of some of the things that need to happen, but that Gandalf has higher priorities, and that's to rise up the Rohirrim.
Okay, but, in which case, he's a bit mean, because if he genuinely senses or knows, because he's kind of a spiritual being, that this is kind of happening. But, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are kind of sad to leave Fangorn because they still haven't found their friends. He's like, no, we have bigger fish to fry now. He could just say to them, look, don't worry about Merry and Pippin. My sense is that they probably are fine and they're here with the Ents. But he doesn't.
It's a little vague how he sort of understands this happening, because he actually says that he saw Treebeard and passed him in the street but didn't talk to him at all. As you said, Bina, that he's a spiritual being, that he's sort of, I guess, picking up on some sort of powers or something. Gandalf doesn't have any foresight powers that I know of, I don't think. But I guess he could be listening to the trees or something.
Like a rumor of the earth. Sorry, Amanda?
It's almost like it's implying that Gandalf the White is a similar person, but not the same person as Gandalf the Grey. It's like, because of his birth, he's gone through changes, and I feel like he's become not colder, but more like, he's been brought back because he has to coordinate everyone going to war at the same time. So he has bigger priorities, and he has to just trust the two pairs, both pairs of hobbits, that they're going to do their thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. That he's back in a war footing. He's not the cuddly old grandpa of old.
No fireworks.
Yeah, but it still struck me as a bit chancy. Unless he really truly knows, because as much as it was important, to set the bait with Theoden at Helm's Deep, ultimately, well, my kind of reading is that it's really the Ents who win, so who help that victory by crushing Saruman's troops as they're about to leave Helm's Deep. But I guess we can discuss that in Nadia's chapter later.
Well, they don't. They actually wait for the troops to leave, and they just sort of go at the Isengard itself. All Isengard has emptied at this point.
Yeah, and then the Huorns follow them.
Oh, okay, so basically it doesn't matter.
Well, of course the Ents play a crucial role. Without them, they never could have done it, but they just didn't really attack the armies. I guess the Huons did, like, after the battle at Helm's Deep, but the Ents only sort of went after, like, the support staff and the servants at Isengard.
Okay. They went after the B-listers.
Well, there's also the infrastructure, too.
It might be implying the fact that when he says he hears rumblings, that he's hearing the Entmoot, because it might currently be happening at the same time.
Actually, I think it would be happening because I guess it was 2 days ago that the battle where the Rohirrim fought the Orcs happened. So if that was 2 days ago, then, I think it took them 2 days for the Entmoot to happen. So yeah, it might actually be happening right at the same time. I never picked that up. The rumbling could actually be them talking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. That's a really good observation.
Okay.
So at that point, then Gandalf starts talking about Saruman, how he's hurting both sides by playing as his own kind of player. So Saruman's trying to make himself a Dark Lord or, a lord over everything. And so by doing so, he's hurting Sauron because he is causing Sauron to hasten his plans, and it seems like Sauron's not quite ready to begin his full assault, but now he has to push his timetable forward. And also, he's hurting the other side, so he's not helping, the forces of good by creating distrust and everything else within them. And another interesting thing that Gandalf says is that the enemy would never think that the ring would not go to Minas Tirith. That the enemy knows that the ring is on the move, and it's probably headed to Minas Tirith, and that's where all of his forces were kind of stationed to ambush them. But he would never expect that they would actually try and destroy the ring. I think that goes to say, the story is not ultimately about power, but it is about good and about the destruction of evil power. Gandalf then talks, this is the first time Gandalf mentions the winged Nazgul. We've seen the Nazgul a couple times. They've been referenced before, but this is the first time that we've actually found that there was actually, a Nazgul that is flying out there. We also find out, and I thought this was a little interesting, that Gimli asked Gandalf if Gandalf was the one that Gimli saw last night. And Gandalf specifically says that the three of them did not see Gandalf. And so it was actually Saruman that they saw. We do know that Saruman's out on the prowl, which kind of goes a little bit against what you would be thinking he was doing. But he's still out on the prowl, and also Gandalf. So there was two of them out there. One of them was trying to look like the other, or, they both just look very similar. Gandalf.
It's interesting how Saruman is actually sort of abroad, like, how fast can he travel? I mean, he doesn't have shadow effects or anything. I mean, is it actually him, or is it like him sort of like using the Palantir to cast his eye toward that place or something? I mean, Saruman to me seems like he wouldn't really leave the safety of Orthanc just to sort of spy around.
But isn't Orthanc quite close to Fangorn, though?
Yeah, it is,
but it's miles. I mean, it's not something that you would think someone who is planning major assaults would be walking around, especially on the opposite side of the forest, which is where they were. It might be the Palantir. I don't know. Maybe the Palantir does cast shadows.
This is around the time when he's, organizing his forces to go against the Rohirrim, so would you really have the time to get up and leave?
He was waiting for troops to come back, and then they got wiped out, so he might have just been investigating it.
They thought they might have the ring, so he's like, I gotta go see if it's there.
So, do we know if the Palantir can help him send a projection? I don't remember that happening. So,
yeah, I don't think it can, Joanna. I don't think the Palantir can do projections. What I think might be happening, he might be able to kind of wraith himself in some way. Like maybe he does have a means to project a version of himself, but I just think the Palantir is a kind of communication device, but I haven't read the Silmarillion, so...
I think you're right, Joanna, actually. The Palantir that Saruman has, it's the Palantir of Orthanc. It's actually sort of locked into Barad-dûr right now because Sauron sort of seized the Palantir, and it can only go to Barad-dûr right now. Gandalf sort of speculates that he's tempted to try and sort of wrench it away from that place, but right now it can only view Orthanc and get orders from there.
So then Gandalf briefs the three of them on the Ents. Gimli says something interesting. He says that he thought that Fangorn was dangerous, and Gandalf mentions that everyone is dangerous. That the Dark Lord is dangerous, but Aragorn is also dangerous. And Legolas is dangerous, and even you, Gimli, is dangerous in your own fashion. So I think it was just interesting that all of it was a quiet reminder that all of these people are very strong and are capable of many things, which we'll see later. And then finally they talk about one of the big things in here, and it's very philosophical, and I thought we might discuss was that Gandalf mentions how he is Gandalf the White, but black is mightier still, which I thought is very interesting when you consider Tolkien's religious beliefs, where he is Catholic, which believes that when the two forces come together, that good will always triumph. He doesn't use the words powerful; he used mightier, and so maybe it comes down to the use of power.
I think he was just saying that he can't directly oppose Sauron, because he's not powerful enough.
Is that it? I thought they were both Myers, so they would be, very similar in strength.
But there's still different levels of power.
But isn't there a line at some point where he says, when it's about nicking the Palantir, where he says, I'm glad I didn't look into it because, number one, I would have revealed too much of our plans, but number two, I'm not yet powerful enough to have gone up against it. And I just think Gandalf at this stage, even though he's Gandalf the White, maybe thinks he isn't quite up there with Saruman. Certainly not with Sauron. But there is a little bit of faith. There is a bit of defeatism, like with him and Galadriel. There's always this kind of touch of fatalism, like even if we win this battle, we'll lose the war kind of thing. And some things can't be undone. And all of these characters at one stage or another have a little bit of it's going to be so tough, we may not win, but we'll fight anyway.
Yeah.
I think you're definitely right about Sauron, that Gandalf probably isn't his match right now, but he totally makes Saruman his bitch when they get to Orthanc, so I mean, he's more powerful than Saruman right now, so...
Yeah, good point.
More powerful than Saruman, but not Sauron.
Maybe it's because Tolkien's making some sort of point about the arrogance of Saruman is that he tries to fool Sauron and also take advantage of his power and use the Palantir for other things, but he can only see what Sauron allows him to see, because Sauron limits the Palantir. Maybe it's about the forces of good can't be as arrogant, because if they go, if you look at the way the tactics they use, it's about not directly opposing, but gathering, instead trying to gather a team as opposed to opposing one-on-one, mano-to-mano, because then they'll lose, because they're not willing to go use the ring or other such things that would make them turn evil anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it's about community.
And also, maybe the true power isn't humility and self-awareness. And, there is no hubris in Gandalf or Galadriel, but there's a lot of hubris in Saruman, and that's his undoing.
So, at that point, they decide that they need to go to Edoras to see Theoden and discuss the battles that will come. And this is the point where Legolas and everyone says that, what about the other hobbits that they see? Gandalf mentions that it's not that they're completely giving up and that they need to have patience, and that they must go where they are most needed. Or they still don't know how he came back. And I thought this was really interesting. If you see Gandalf, the last time you saw him was falling down from this bridge. Gandalf explains that he, when he was fighting the Balrog, that they fell from the bridge and they eventually fought their ways up the tower, the Durin's Tower, and up the endless stairs. And I thought it was interesting that the only way that he was able to escape was when they crashed into the water after falling from the bridge. He just followed the Balrog. And the Balrog was escaping and going through all these tunnels, and pretty much Gandalf was just chasing after him. Once the Balrog was able to get back out into air, he burst into flame, and they fought again. And then finally the Balrog was cast down. Gandalf then strayed out of thought and time, and then was sent back naked. His task wasn't done. And at that point, he was able to make it to Lothlorien, just a couple days after they left, which I thought was interesting considering the timing and everything with Lothlorien that the Fellowship went through. And he brought back 3 messages, one to Aragorn that talks about, that pretty much foreshadows the use of the dead army, one to Legolas saying that if he hears the cry of the gull on the shore, that he should rest in the forest no more. And I haven't finished my complete reread, so I don't know where this one goes. I'm pretty sure it just means that, when he goes to the west, that he'll be going to the west. And then to Gimli...
I think it's Legolas hasn't ever been to the sea yet, and so when they go to Gondor and they come from the south and sort of intercept the courses of Umber, Legolas sees the sea for the first time, and that's sort of like he gets that yearning to go to the west after that.
And then I thought it was really funny where, like, Gandalf then stops, and then Gimli says, "What? There's no Gimli asked about a message for him, and Legolas, is sitting. He's like, "Oh, dark are the words that were sent to him," and Legolas is saying things like, "Oh, well, aren't you glad you didn't get any bad news?" And Gimli's like, "No, I want to hear from his girlfriend, Galadriel." Gandalf's like, "Oh yeah, I forgot. Galadriel sends her greetings, and that wherever he goes, the thought is with him. So be careful."
So cute.
I know. It's
so funny. Afterwards, Gimli is like so giddy, and he's like, "Okay, let's go find some orcs. I want to do some killing right now." That's just weird. It just goes straight to that.
I feel like Gandalf was just like, "Oh yeah, she said she's always thinking about you." Okay, so next.
Galadriel's got her picture of you inside her locker.
And so at that point, they start walking back to the edge of the forest, and then they realize that they still don't have their horses, and that it's going to be a very long walk. Gandalf calls Shadowfax, and with Shadowfax comes the other horses, and then they all ride off to go see Theoden. And that is the end of chapter 5.
I just want to go back a little bit to the tunnels beneath Moria. I think it's really sort of truly like awe-inspiring, the language, like where Gandalf describes it like, "I came at last to the uttermost foundations of stone. He was with me still. We fought far under the living earth, where time is not counted. Ever he clutched at me, and ever I hewed him, till at last he led to a dark tunnels. They were not made by Durin's folk. Far, far below the deepest delvings of dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things. Even Sauron knows them not." I'm fascinated by this stuff, here under the earth, the world is gnawed by nameless things that are older than Sauron. I mean, what do you guys think about those?
It's very sinister.
Fireworm.
Did you guys want to talk a little bit about Gandalf's sort of reincarnation in general? I mean, did his sort of physical body die? Or, I mean, Gwai here says that he's so light that if he dropped him, he would probably just float or something. I mean, when the Istari came to Middle-earth, I think they were given mortal bodies or something.
Yeah, I think he's like a Cylon and he's just regenerated in a new body.
Probably just went to the Hall of the Undying. Do you think because he died, went to the Hall of Undying in the west, and then came back?
Yeah, but he didn't come back like Glorfindel came back on a boat, physically came back. I guess he sort of just respawned at the top of the mountain, and Gwai here picked him up over there.
Yeah, so my imagining is he kind of came back, he sort of respawns as almost like a race-type version of himself, which is why he's so light for however you pronounce the King of the Eagles. By the time he's walking around in Lothlorien, he's kind of almost fully materializing back to his previous mass, if that makes any sense.
It does, because if you think about what happens with the ringwraiths when they die, when their bodies die in the flood outside of, what do you call it, Elrond's house, I can't think of it right now. Rivendell, thank you. Shocking lack of knowledge. Anyway, and they make a point about the fact that they're not going to respawn for some time because their physical bodies were destroyed, and so they had to float back to Mordor, and it was so that could be a similar kind of thing with Gandalf, but they might have expedited it, since they needed him to come back faster.
Yeah, I guess it has to be a different body because it says that he was sort of sent back naked. But does he still have glamoring his sword though? I mean, this is visual stuff, of course, from the movies, but he has a new staff that's white and not the wooden staff.
When they go to Edoras, does he use his sword there? I don't think so.
He uses it at Minas Tirith when he's fighting me, because he has the staff and he's got the sword.
I think there's the final chapter when they're all gathered to attack Mordor to help Frodo, and you have the description of them raising, as usual, Aragorn raising his sword as they meet the forces at the Black Gates. I'm sure they mentioned glamdring there, but I'll have to look it up and see if I can find it for the next podcast.
I thought he had glamdring at the Hornburg, but maybe that's just the movie kind of filtering in as well.
All good. So I believe Whiteraven doing the chapters. So we are now for the the reader who's following along at home, we're going back to chapters 3 and 4, which are the Uruk-Hai and Treebeard, which may or may not be successful in keeping all the stories straight. But anyway, over to Brett.
In the start of the chapter, Pippin wakes up and he's surrounded by orcs, and they're orcs from Moria, Mordor, and Isengard, and they all want to take him to a different place. Like, some want to take, the Mordor orcs want to take him to Burz, but they want to take them across the river so the Nazgul can get them. And then the Moria orcs just want to kill them and be off, because all they came for is to avenge their orc friends, I guess. Then the Isengarders obviously want to bring them to Saruman. Pippin wakes up and he starts remembering all the stuff that happened. He remembers Merry somehow cutting off a bunch of orcs' arms and hands, because apparently Merry's pretty badass. And then I find it kind of hard to believe Merry, like, just hewing off hands left and right, but hey, it's a nice visual image.
He had an Elvis blade.
Yeah,
it's made by the Dunedain and the Men of Arnor, actually, the barrow blade.
Yeah, it was the one they found there. I don't have any problem with it, I just think it's kind of... they must have been like, oh my god, he cut my hand off.
Well, I mean, if they were not trying to kill him, they were just trying to capture him. That gives him a significant advantage there.
I guess I've never tried to cut a hand off. I just feel it would be harder than just swinging a sword, but maybe not. So Pippin, he wakes up and he wishes Gandalf hadn't convinced Elrond to let them come. We get an appearance from the orc tickler, tells them they would tickle them if they weren't supposed to keep them healthy. So the orcs stop and they start having their little debate, and one of the orcs calls the other orcs cannibals, so Ugluk decides to kill a bunch of them. After they get killed, a bunch of them get killed, Ugluk says, okay, we're headed for Isengard, and everybody just kind of falls in at that point. And Pippin frees his hands on a dead orc in the melee. So the orcs run for a while, then they stop, and the scouts tell them they saw a solo rider who got away. And so they wake up the hobbits and give them some orc juice, and they heal Merry with some kind of black nasty stuff that's in a box. And I think it's funny, when Merry wakes up, he's still got a sense of humor, and he's like, where's the bed and breakfast out here? And then the orcs start running again and tell them they're going to have to run. So Pippin, while they're running, runs off, and he leaves his brooch, and they get them back on track, so Aragorn can find that. The orcs stop, and they give him another draft, and they throw him some bread and a bowl of brown, and they choose not to eat the meat because they don't know where it came from. And the northern orcs split off to the woods, and the Isengard orcs still try to stay going towards Saruman. And I think it's interesting that they don't want to bring the Nazgul over the river yet, because they want to keep them a secret. The orcs end up stopping because the riders are right behind them, and they stop to wait for morning, while the orcs stop and they try to wait for the reinforcements from the woods to come. And while Ugluk is trying to maintain order, Grishnak takes two hobbits off to the side where Pippin convinces him that he has the ring and that he'll give it to him if he lets them go. He doesn't let them go, but he gets a spear from one of the Rohirrim when he tries to drag away the hobbits. And then Pippin and Merry have a little Lembas picnic, and they head off into the forest while the orcs are slaughtered. And I think it's funny how the hobbits are so easygoing that they're just like, oh, well, we'll just sit here and eat, and then, all right, let's go. And then they just start talking about it like nothing bad even happened to them. Yeah. And the Rohirrim kill the rest of the orcs, and Éomer takes on Ugluk one-on-one, and that's the end of that chapter.
That's probably the first sort of competent thing that Pippin does. I mean, sort of like using his cleverness against Shashnik or whatever his name is, the orc that carried them off. I mean, has he done anything like useful before this point?
Yeah, and then at the end, Merry's like, you might even get a chapter in Bilbo's book, and here it is, right here.
I love the description that Tolkien uses at the end when they're walking, and how it's like, oh, you would never imagine that they were, on the precipice of war and everything, that they're just, gossiping about, the weather or something like that.
But I think that's really clever. Like, at this point in the book, we need a bit of light relief, We've just had the burial of Boromir, and I think it just really works well. But other than that, I have to say I'm not massively that interested in what the different orcs have to say and the different factions. It was all a bit, whatever. Move on.
Yeah, I kind of skipped over that. I don't find it that interesting either.
It wasn't the first time that we've seen, like, orcs not as, the red shirt bad guys, right?
Yeah.
Because every other time, it's always like, oh, orcs are coming, or I guess we saw a little bit of it in The Hobbit, but we've never seen, the fact that orcs are tribes and, they're kind of fighting against each other and everything.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting that evil doesn't trust evil.
But it's brilliant because what you're getting is this rivalry between Sauron and Saruman, But instead of seeing it at that kind of like epic mythic level, you're just seeing it amongst the people that kind of the minions who work for them, which is like far more funny and far more relatable in a way. And I love this idea that evil mars its own claim. Like good people just need to stand by and just eat their lemon spread while the evil people just duff each other up, which is hilarious.
In fact, it was the Pippin saying that Saruman was going to get whatever they had that made Grishnak take him off to the side instead of just saying, well, no, we'll wait.
Exactly, and it does remind me a bit of The Hobbit, and actually, that kind of like the Bilbo using, he can't use his strength, but he'll use his trickiness and just kind of like stirring up a bit of shit amongst the orcs. So I like it. It brings us back to the prequels a little bit.
I guess this is like the first time we sort of see orcs in their sort of natural habitat. Well, not really, but sort of they're like talking to each other in their own kind of world. Like we actually see their side of things. But I guess since we're kind of short on time, I guess we could talk about orcs in the Sam and Frodo part of Return of the King. A lot of that there as well.
Yeah, and we'll need to talk about orcs there because otherwise it's just going to be Sam and Frodo for like a whole episode.
It's strange that we get their point of view, but there's never any sympathy there. It's not like Martin where he'll go off onto somebody else and you're like, oh, well, I guess I kind of see where this is coming from now. And this, you just don't care about them. They're like, oh, yeah, we don't care about anything but ourselves.
Yeah, Tolkien has actually said that he sort of feels that he failed there, that he sort of wanted to go back and redeem the orcs somehow, that now they're just sort of irredeemable evil guys that don't have any hope for anything.
But in fairness to the orcs, it's not like they're men who've chosen to do bad like Saruman. They were kind of bred to do evil, so you can't kind of hold them individually responsible for being shitty. I mean, that is what they are, Okay, on to the next chapter.
So, Merry and Pippin head into Fangorn, and they drink from the Entwives, and it raises their spirits and heals their bodies. They go to the hill that's all lit up, and it's rocky, so there's no trees there, and they meet Treebeard. I thought it was interesting while Merry was up there on that hill, he said he could feel the wind changing. And then when Gandalf has his chapter later on that we already talked about, he talked about how the winds were changing and it was like the turning of the war. And Treebeard brings the hobbits to his home and gives them some kind of draft to make their hair twirly. I don't really understand that part. But he tells them that elves taught the trees how to speak, and they gave the Ents their language, so that's why they are more partial to elves than most others. Treebeard has the hobbits tell him their story, and then when they get to Saruman, it rouses his anger toward him, and he tells them how he used to like Saruman and used to tell him things, but Saruman never told him anything back. That's when he decides to have an Entmoot to decide what to do about Saruman. The next day, they go to the Entmoot, and they talk about how the Ents look different, but they all have the same eyes, so they can tell that they're all the same. And the Ents decide that they are going to go to war. They finish their little war song and head off to war. They started moving, and then the trees followed them. And I guess that's the end of that chapter.
I think what you said was really interesting, how Saruman sort of had this kind of, I guess, one-way relationship with Treebeard, how Treebeard used to tell him things, but Saruman never sort of gave anything back. I guess that sort of just proves that Saruman was sort of rotten all along, that he never was good, that he was always like a proud asshole.
Gandalf, to a smaller level, kind of does the same thing, where people tell him stuff, and they're just like, oh, interesting. And then he never tells anybody anything. And then he wonders why he has to keep calling people fools.
Absolutely. But, I mean, that's the voice of Saruman, and I think that's why you have to, even though, we know that Gandalf is the boss of Saruman when they meet at Orthanc after all the battles, but at the end of the day, Gandalf still has respect for the voice of Saruman and how evil it can be and how tricky it can be, and even he kind of will say that he will be on guard and doesn't quite trust himself, because by being charming, he gets all the information. I
actually have just a question to throw out there to everybody else. When they're talking about the Entwives, and earlier on he said that trolls are they made from Ents, or are they just like the answer to Ents? Well, he kind of makes a parallel, doesn't he? He says trolls are to Ents as orcs are to elves. Right. I didn't know if he meant that's just like who fought them in the battlefield, or if they actually made them from them. So,
I think it's like that Morgoth or whatever they made the trolls, that he got jealous about the Ents and was like, fine, I'll make my own, and took like a clump of stone and animated it or something and made it like a troll, and then it turned out all shitty and dumb and all that. And so he didn't kidnap Ents. He didn't kidnap Ents and do what they did to the elves and just make them into their own thing. No, I don't think so. It's just sort of like a parallel. I mean, I think Treebeard actually says that they're like a poor mockery or something.
Well, so are the orcs of the elves.
They're still sort of like both biological creatures of blood and flesh.
Okay.
So trolls are more connected to stone, and they turn to stone, and then the Ents are trees. They are not exactly the same as the orcs and the elves. They are more different. They are.
Yeah, that's actually interesting thing. I mean, it says that in Treebeard's description, like it looked like that his skin looked like bark, or that he was wearing clothes that looked like bark, or that his skin actually was bark. So it's sort of left a little ambiguous, but what do you guys think? Are the Ents sort of actually, are they made of like tree matter?
I never thought that. I thought like the movie did a poor job at representing them, because I guess the way that I always read it is, you know, they're these giant human-like creatures, but they're not trees, because they say they become tree-ish, but it's more in their attitudes and in their manners.
Isn't their beards made of moss and like?
So I guess this comes down to I thought it was more like, you know, when you go back and read how like the wings of the Balrog, you know, and how it's more of a simile or a metaphor. You know, the wings were like shadow and everything, and I always thought the Ents, their beards were like moss.
Yeah, but it's easy to mistake them for trees, right? Many people flying onto Treebeard thinking...
Yeah, they saw it. They would just said that tree looks like an old man.
They're just kind
talk about like how some Ents become trees and actually sort of essentially become trees. They sort of lose their sentience. I mean, I guess all the Warrens, they aren't that. They're just wild trees, some of them, but I guess some of them might have been former Ents.
It's almost like feral cats. When you think about the Bjorns, they're just like feral Ents. They're not who have like lost all of their like higher thinking.
The whole Entwive thing is just so sad. You know, how the Entwives just wanted to sit there and, you know, make these beautiful things, and the Ents could never seem to satisfy them, and they lost them during the war and everything else. It's just...
do you guys have any theories about where the Entwives are?
That's where I was kind of going, but if nobody thinks that the trolls are actually Ents that were turned into trolls, then it doesn't work. I was saying,
Well,
maybe
what, you
when...
think the Entwives became trolls?
Well, hypothetically, obviously. If that's the
That's
case...
mind-blowing.
They would have needed some females, and they said when they went to their fields, they were all devastated and destroyed, and they were all gone. They would have needed a breeding population of trolls, so you would have needed male and female, and to make them, if that is in fact how it happened.
I thought it was more maybe that the Entwives were maybe down in the beautiful green gardens when the first war happened, and so didn't survive because, and you know, now the Ents say, well, the gardens were destroyed in the first war, now the woods will be destroyed in the second, and maybe they just were a victim of environmental devastation.
But they say that they lost them. They didn't die, that they just lost them, that they weren't there. They didn't see any bodies or anything.
But when they went to the fields of the Entwives, they were ruined, right?
Yeah, they were devastated.
So presumably the Entwives died.
I thought about this theory that because it said that the Entwives, they sort of like, they weren't really a big fan of these forests and wild places. They had fields and gardens and stuff like that.
Right.
And then there's the idea that Ents, they can sort of meld into their environment when they sort of lose their will to live, I guess. They become trees and just sort of become part of the natural world. There's the fact that Treebeard asks the hobbits that have they seen any Entwives, where they're from. And the Shire is like extremely fertile, the land. It's the kind of place that the Entwives might have liked. So I thought that maybe the Entwives went to north to the Shire and sort of melded with the land there and just became like part of the Shire there. And that
well, then the Ents didn't do a very good search.
Yeah, I don't know where they searched really. They seem kind of absent-minded, really.
I think they just asked people that passed by about the Entwives. They never really searched for them. Did any of you see that one theory that says that there weren't ever any Entwives and only the oldest Ents are sort of confused. I don't really remember. And then the youngest one came up with the idea because they are so old, they no longer remember how they came to be. And maybe they have a sexual reproduction like some plants. There weren't really any Entwives.
So to put it in Game of Thrones terms, they forgot where to put it.
Okie dokie. Any other comments on this chapter?
Well, just the descriptions of the Ents. There are some very beautiful descriptions of the Ents.
About that ring that the Ents gave Merlin and Pippin, don't they mention that later on, that it made them taller and something else that I can't remember right now. And Gandalf says that they should have been careful or something.
Apparently it made them taller from what Gimli says to them when they show up.
Taller with curlier hair, which is hilarious. and another bit that I think they do really beautifully in the movie is then provide some much needed comic relief.
Yeah, but I think that's only in the extended cut though.
Is it? Okay. I'm so used to watching it in the extended version that I find it hard to...
Oh, like the one where they're standing there like, oh, I'm taller than you, and then he drinks and he's like, no, I'm taller than you now.
Yeah, it's so cute.
Yeah, that's an extended edition.
And they give a little bit to Tom Bombadil's lines to Treebeard.
Okay, so on to the next chapter, which I believe it's a big one. It's the King of Golden Hall.
Yes.
So over to you, Amanda. That's a good one to take.
So we're back with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. They're riding with Gandalf to the Rohirrim's ancestral rest. Gandalf has them riding night and day, only stopping for a couple hours to sleep, so they're very tired. So they stop, and they're in this beautiful pastoral field, and there's a mountain, and they see the Golden Hall surrounded by wooden houses and a wooden palisade. Gandalf explains this is Edoras, and the Great Hall is Meduseld, a great hall of men. And he cautions them not to speak any harsh words and not draw their weapons, because the Rohirrim are really wary, at least until there's King Theoden. They see a lot of flowers, because it's Tolkien, and graves of former leaders of the Rohirrim, most of whose names are King. Aragorn then recites a poem about Errol the young, and they arrive at the castle. Yeah. Okay, so the Rohirrim guards are super suspicious of them, paranoid. They ask how they got the horses, and whether they're spies of Saruman, which they wouldn't tell them if they were. Gandalf clarifies that 1, they're not ghosts, 2, that Éomer gave them the horses. The guards get shifty when Éomer is brought up and bring up worm tongues. Gandalf's like, what is? I'm here to see Theoden, not some steward, and introduces the four adventurers. The guard goes and gets the okay for them to go inside, but tells them that no weapons are going to be allowed, including staves. They then speak with Hama the door warden, and there's a bit of a kerfuffle because Aragorn doesn't want to hand over Narsil. But after Gandalf points out essentially in his house, Theoden's rules, you're not the king yet, etc., he and Gimli hand over their weapons, and Legolas just like, whatever, here's my... Hama tries to get Gimli to hand over his axe, and Gandalf's like, look how old and feeble I am. Would you take an old man's only support? And he feels bad and backs off. Or, like, has a bit of on it. They walk in, and Theoden looks extremely old, and Éomer is sitting by him.
Let's just pause a little minute, because it's kind of cool to just discuss that whole kerfuffle at the entrance, because there's 2 points to make here. Number one, this whole chapter, like the fact that it's called the Meduseld, the way it's decorated with all the colour, which is really cool compared to Gondor, which is a big parallel. But the whole way in which they have to leave the weapons, but then one of them is allowed to take one in, is a total kind of line-for-line translation of the Beowulf, which of course Tolkien as an old English professor would have been very familiar with. So that's point number one. Point number two is about Hama, and I love how, again, this is my point about Riders of Rohan having a lot more initiative, like he's allowed to take the initiative that he's going to let Gandalf in. I have this kind of personal theory. It's not that he's taken in with Gandalf saying, oh, but I'm a weak old man. I think Hama is a good man. He's like the Davos Seaworth of this novel. And he sees that Theoden's been just totally taken over by the cunningly named Wormtongue. And he sees these guys like Gandalf and these guys come from the west who could save them. And he's like, yeah, let's just let this wizard in with his staff because maybe he's going to do some good. So that's my kind of secret fantasy theory about Hama.
No, that's always what I like to think.
Of course, I'm not the only one.
No. Hama's great because it's a really good example. Tolkien can tell you a lot about an individual character without telling you a ton. It's like you know so much about Hama just from the little things that he does in that scene and like the next coming scenes after this, I feel like.
Yeah, he's actually a character I care about even though he has such little screen time. He's kind of like another stupid analogy. It's like Wedge Antilles in Star Wars. Just like seems really solid and with a lot of integrity. I don't know much about him, but I want him to do well.
Yeah.
Well, he doesn't.
Peace, you're like the voice of doom.
Well, his body is hewn against the Hornburg during the Battle of Helm's Deep.
They had his fate.
Okay. So they walk in, and the hall's beautiful, but it's just like very somber and like dark. And Theoden looks extremely old, and Wormtongue and Éowyn are sitting with them. Gandalf and Wormtongue get into a bit of like shit talking. Wormtongue is just being like, you always have bad news, and that ill news is an ill guest. There's a lot of insidious comments about Gandalf and Galadriel, to which Gimli again is like, step off. but instead Gandalf decides to pull up about Lothbrok. Well, he also does an outfit change, revealing his Gandalf the White outfit. And he says, and I love this quote, "I'm not past through fire and death, and words with the serving man till the lightning falls." And then he points to a window, and I'm always there's like, how much, in the movie there's a lot of like magic that happens here, but I'd like to open up, it's like, how much do you think is just like him, just like getting up to Theoden through his words, and how much of it do you think it's like, there's like a very like clear magical transformation in the movie, and I can't really like visually interpret what happens.
I think it sort of happens a lot more gradually in the book, obviously, because he sort of starts to stand up straighter after he sees his country and grasps his sword and all that. Obviously they can't do it very gradually in the movie, so they just had to, the sort of exorcism thing. But I think this is sort of based on kind of one of King Arthur's myths again. At least has some parallels to that. I mean, I think it's called the Fisher-King, where the sort of the life of the king is the life of the kingdom, in a sense that Theoden starts to get better after he goes outside and sort of looks upon his land and his kingdom, gets rejuvenated from that. I mean, I guess one example of maybe you know better is from the Lion King, where sort of when Mufasa is the king, everything is like green and alive and good. And when Brother Scar, who is evil, becomes king, everything's dead and dying and cold and shitty and all that.
Yeah, I definitely agree, especially considering with the Fisher-King stuff, there's also the part to it, I believe, where it's like the king is alive for the land and the king dies for the land. And I feel like we see Theoden do that later, and it's kind of like they're making up for all of his things before, but we'll talk about that when we get to Return of the King.
I'm a big fan of both scenes in the book and the movie as well. I really like it in the movie, even though it's a little more sort of magic-y, like what Matt was talking about in his chapter about how magic in Tolkien is a lot more like sort of unseen, like this sort of mind thing. And in the movie, Saruman is pretty much outright possessing Theoden there, but here it's just sort of Grimo's bad counsel, and I guess he's sort of like poisoned his mind as well.
So maybe this is a good point to discuss. Is it a bit of a slightly weird touch for Tolkien to call Grima Wormtongue?
But that's not his actual name.
That's not his actual name. Like, that's the nickname that the people have given him after his influence on Theoden then. It just always struck me as a bit hammy.
I guess what you guys were talking about earlier, like Hama is a good man, and most of the men of Edoras are good dudes, and they sort of like, they despise Grima for like leading their king astray, but they respect Theoden so much that because it is technically his orders, so they obey them, but it rankles them, really.
I'm just really surprised that up to this point, given that Éomer is such a cool dude, and that all the guys like below Theoden and Grima seem really sorted, why they didn't get together and decide to either kill Wormtongue or kind of usurp Theoden.
I feel like something like that happens, though, because I think that's why Éomer is imprisoned. Like, they don't literally have a rebellion, but I think that there's definitely some, like, talk happening.
And maybe that's why Hama then lets Éomer back in, and, yeah, maybe it would have happened anyway without these
I think
showing up.
That's the reason why they don't, like, sort of try to usurp Theoden is all of them probably hate Grima, except, like, he probably has some cronies. They respect Theoden so much, so you can see it when he sort of recovers, and they all just sort of fall on their knees before him and, like, offer him their swords. Like, they really love Theoden, and they just probably can't understand why he's doing all this, like, shitty things.
Something that Bina and I were kind of just both entering in the Yule back before is that it's like Hama is almost like a Barristan, like, somebody would want to be, is like someone who has a bit more moral agency and like acts to do something to correct a bad situation.
Yeah, like if Hama had been on the Kingsguard, he wouldn't have beaten up Sansa.
No.
But the difference is I think that there are so many of these characters in Rohan that you see differentiated, but in Gondor you never get that. So later when we get to Gondor, we can do the parallels with Rohan. But I love how these guys feel free to question. So when Boromir goes off to Faramir's going to get a lot of like really stupid orders, but he doesn't feel he has the capacity to say no. Whereas here, lots of people question people above them and just use their initiative, which I love.
And what you mentioned earlier about all the colors and all that, I think that's also very cool how... this actually reminds me of something of what in the Desolation of Smaug, Gilly says something like that starlight is a very cold light. But in Rohan, they have a lot of colors. Their banners are green and red and yellow, and their buildings are made of wood and sort of very warm colors and all that. But in Gondor, everything is made of cold stone, and their banners are black and white, and there's a sort of like all about stars and the dead tree and all that. They're sort of very more somber than the Rohirrim.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a civilization fallen into. It's almost like it's barren, whereas the colours of Rohan, like red and green, are so fertile, and horses on grass. I mean, it's just wonderful. And I think that's done beautifully in the film. Just the care and attention of all, when they're riding off to Helm's Deep and in battle, all those beautiful tabards that they wear, and the flags and pennants and the tents and, you know, all the tapestries that hang when they're in the Meduseld are just so stunningly beautiful. Like, if I could have, like, any props at all from any of the kingdoms, so to say, I would take them from Rohan.
Yeah, it's like a South Asian wedding.
Yeah.
It's just red and green are like the typical South Asian wedding colors. Yeah.
Absolutely there. I love Rohan.
Okay, so where we left off, Gandalf then points to the window, he says some hopeful words, the sun beams in through the windows, and Theoden stands up. So with, like, support from Eowyn, Wormtongue starts saying a bunch of other, like, insidious, conniving things, and then he gets frightened by the lightning. Eowyn guides Theoden outside, and they gaze at the kingdom, and it's felt that it's like the first time that Theoden's like really looked at his kingdom in a long time, and he feels hope for the first time, and he takes Gandalf's counsel to release Eomer from prison. Gandalf whispers messages of hope into Theoden's ear, which I think, and I'm open it up to the group, includes like basic knowledge of what Frodo and Sam are doing, and other things that are going on in the kingdoms. Eomer is brought forward, and he lit forward by Hama, and lays his sword at Theoden's feet, and then Theoden has his like amazing fourth Eorlingas speech and their celebration, and it's amazing.
No, I mean, I definitely think the messages of hope, if not about Frodo in the ring, because that might be a bit too sensitive, I definitely think he says, don't worry, we know Saruman has betrayed us, but the trees are rising, the Ents have risen, and they're going to act. So I think he probably feels he's not alone. And also maybe he tells them that, you know, Aragorn is going to march to Minas Tirith so that Gondor will be stronger than it has been. And yeah, just in general, fourth Eorlingas. Oh my goodness, I love that phrase. It's my most favourite phrase of the books. And whenever I watch the movies and I see, there are two scenes that I love. The one when they're in Helm's Deep and Theoden gets tooled up and he rides out, fourth Eorlingas on his horse to certain death, is just, that makes me...
Every time I watch that, I'm like,
yeah,
like Gimli in that scene, I'm like, yes! Yes!
Exactly. And then the second time when he does it when they're about to ride, when they're at Minas Tirith and they're about to charge. Oh my goodness. That's what movies are about, really, and that's what great books are about, when they make you feel that excited.
I love that, like a hopeless courage that they're just sort of riding to their doom.
Yeah.
But when they bring forth Theoden's sword, like here, I love this like little throwaway sentence here when they went through Wormtongue's like chest. It says that many other things are there which men have missed. I mean, you asshole! He was just like stealing everybody's stuff and putting them in his chest. That little throwaway sentence just says so much. It's just so funny to me.
There's not a lot after that, but it's important. Gandalf reveals that Wormtongue was in Saruman's employ, and his reward, and it's amazing because he just like castigates him with his words, and he points out his reward was to be Eowyn and money after all the Rohirrim were dead. Gandalf gives him the opportunity to fight and die honorably, and leaves. And Eomer, some of them want to go after him, but Theoden like tells them to just let him go, essentially. They then all eat dinner, and Theoden just lets Gandalf keep Shadowfax. And then it's a lot of like mustering. Everyone starts putting on armor, and Gimli, because they don't have armor that's adult dwarf size, he ends up getting Theoden's childhood armor.
I think he just gets a shield. I mean, it said that the dwarf armor that they made for him at the Lonely Mountain is better than anything that men can make, so he didn't really need armor.
Anyway, Eowyn's put in charge at the people's request to leading Meduseld until they come back. They all ride out extremely epically to the hold of Dunharrow.
But they don't take all the wives and kiddies with them, which is what happens in the movies and always pisses me off a little bit. I just want to ask her out there, why do they let Wormtongue go? Is it that Gandalf wants him to take the message to Saruman that, I've taken Saruman, I've foiled your plans, now Theoden's awake? Or is it just because good guys show mercy in these books, or why?
I think it's mostly Theoden's decision, because he says that Wormtongue had given him good service at one time, probably in the beginning, he was a good counselor until Saruman's influence, changed him. So maybe if he just is doing this in remembrance of the original dreamer.
And also maybe thinking if I was so easily taken over, maybe Wormtongue was also taken over. Like he was a good guy, but then got turned.
I love the sort of the wording in this chapter, like the dark hath been my dreams of life. And I guess part of the reason why sort of Theoden's coming out of his stupor or like sort of revival thing is so powerful. I mean, I guess most people can sort of like, identify with sort of seeing someone come out of like a deep depression or something. I don't know, I think this is very powerful. And I think that what they did here in the movie, Gandalf talks about how Grima's like reward would have been Eowyn after all the men are dead. I think what they did in the movie was really smart and works better, how they gave a lot of this dialogue to Eomer actually, and even before Gandalf and Aragorn and all those guys came here. It's sort of, in general, I like the change they did in the movie, like Eomer sort of getting exiled and him being the guy who leads the cavalry and saved them at Helm's Deep, as opposed to this guy Erkenbrand, who we have never really heard of before.
Yeah, it's a really nice, elegant, just keep the cast list smaller.
The only thing I don't like about that is he leaves his sister behind. He's just like, yeah, I've been banished, I'm gone. And she's just like, well, I guess you're just leaving me here with Grima. Great, see you later, bro.
Yeah, but she's the shield maiden of Rohan. I mean, she's not completely helpless.
True.
And actually, that's another thing to point out about Rohan, that, Gondor think they're all high and mighty, but I think it's really interesting that Theoden can leave a woman in charge when he's gone, and people will accept that. So they're obviously not as old school as people think.
Yeah, they actually chose Eowyn.
Yeah, exactly. So they obviously respect her, and she's seen as a credible leader, which is fantastic. And she doesn't have to go off and be a simpering woman cooking shitty meals for Aragorn on the road to Helm's Deep. Ha ha, a woman can't cook because a woman's place is to cook. Ugh. Anyway.
Well, but doesn't that actually, I'm sure that's not like the point of that scene. It's actually that even like, she is a warrior, but nobody will accept her as a warrior. And she is a shitty cook, so that she actually is a good leader and a good warrior, but nobody really sees that, I guess. That's what.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm obviously exaggerating for comic effect.
Alright, yeah.
Sorry. That love triangle they set up is so infuriating. It's so weird.
But there's some of it in the books. I mean, not a sort of teenage love triangle in that sense, but there is a sense in the books that she's been so alone that she's clinging to hope, and Aragorn is the most noble man she's ever seen, so she clings to hope of him, and it's not stupid. She's kind of effectively like a princess of Rohan. But then obviously she transfers it all to Faramir, which is much more suitable.
Yeah, I guess it's definitely better in the extended edition, but if you watch it just like the regular cut with that, it's just like, they like build it out more in the extended edition.
Any more on Rohan before we go to Helm's Deep? Okay, so Nadia, I think that's over to you, and I hope your internet connection holds.
I hope so. I hope my neighbor's internet connection holds. Yeah, okay, so I didn't even know how to summarize this chapter because it's already quite condensed, again, like the Council of Elrond. And I didn't want to summarize this at all. I just want Bina to read this out to me in a dramatic voice.
Well, I can read you the Spark Notes if you want, because that's what I've got open. But I mean, we all know what happens at Helm's Deep, right? I mean, do you want to just give us the key kind of moments so that we can then just chat about them?
So King Theoden and his host are riding swiftly towards the fords of Isen. The day is very hot and they can sense a growing darkness in the east. And then there's another darkness that can be seen at the feet of the Misty Mountains. Gandalf asks Legolas to look closer since he has the keenest eyes of the company. And he likens it to the darkness of the twilight under endless trees, which I'm assuming is Hjorns. Then, as the host nears the White Mountains, a rider approaches with bad news. The king and his men seem to have come too late. After Theodred, the king's son, died, the men at the fords were driven back over the Isen with great losses by the armies of Saruman. Erkenbrand, a marshal of the Westfold, gathered what men he could and retreated to Helm's Deep. The rest of the men are the messenger Seol, who has spoken thinking that these men must be led by Eomer, is surprised and overjoyed when he realizes that they are led by King Theoden. Theoden declares that he will not return to Edoras, without battling Saruman's forces. While Theoden speaks, Gandalf rides ahead and then returns, declaring that the king must ride to Helm's Deep at once instead of rising to the fords. Gandalf then goes on another errand with Shadowfax and promises to return soon. The king and his host now ride with haste towards Helm's Deep, an ancient cosmos said to have been built in the glory days of Gondor by the Sea Kings with the help of giants. When the riders are still in the valley some way from the deep, they are met by bands of wood riders, orcs, and wild men from Dunland, all headed towards Helm's Deep. Their path is littered with the bodies of dead riders, and the number of enemies is reported to be many times the size of the king's force. Behind them, the orcs are burning all of the villages. On reaching Helm's Deep, they find that Uruk-Hai has left it well garrisoned, but he himself has not made it back to the safety of the deep. But most of the men that he's left behind are either old or too young. The caves of the deep are full of the folk of the Westfold, women and children, many beasts, and great food stores. There is little time to wait after they reach the Hornburg, and Eomer quickly organizes his men. The king and his guard are to stay in the Hornburg, along with many Westfold men. Eomer arrays most of his men.
Before we get to the battle, I thought that we could talk a little bit sort of like Theoden's motivations and him sort of riding to war, because reading this, I hadn't read it in a long time, just watching the movies again, like, that's usually the version that I see in my mind, and it's just sort of, in the movies, Theoden has sort of more reluctance riding to war, and he just does it, just do it. And same with the entry. I mean, in the book, it almost seems a little too easy how they sort of convince both the Ents and Theoden to they just sort of recruit these two armies to their cause right away. I think in the movies it actually might be, I mean, the Ents stuff's pretty stupid, but the whole stuff with Theoden, like, being reluctant, I think that's probably a better way to do it. There's this great shot when Theoden is sitting on his throne and Gandalf sits next to him where Wormtongue used to sit, and Gandalf puts his hand Gandalf's hand and is like looking at, oh, is this another evil counselor that's going to lead me to ruin or something like that in the movie. You guys have any thoughts about differences between like Theoden's, the Ents' motivations in the book and the movie?
Well, I much prefer the book, because in the book he makes a concrete decision to go and to fight, and I think what I really hate in the movie is, in the movie there's a point of doubt where he's being all defeatist, and Aragorn, is it Aragorn or Gandalf, have to kind of give a rousing speech to make him put on his armour and do the one last cavalry charge. Whereas here he doesn't need that. And the reason why it makes sense in the context of the movie, it's fine, it's an interesting character, but what I like with Gondor and Rohan is they're very much opposing. And if you have Denethor, who's the king of defeatism and nihilism, then I want Theoden to be much more forthright and right. Now I've shaken off Wormtongue. Even if the numbers are outweighing me, I'm going to go forth. And that's why you don't need all that vacillation and like flakiness in Helm's Deep.
And here Theoden had to make a quick decision, right? These men were already under attack. They had been under attack for some time. So he has to go and relieve these men. So he has to make this decision.
Speaking of the Ents in the movies, I hate the fact that Treebeard has no idea that half his forest is just decimated. He's like, oh my god, what the hell? What happened here? And it's like, why would you not know this?
That sounded so Kyle.
Yeah, he sort of has to be tricked into attacking Isengard.
And then all the Ents are just like, oh no, Treebeard's calling us now for real. We actually have to go.
But that's the thing, like in both of these cases, it's interesting. In both of these cases, what the movie is doing is bigging up the role of the Fellowship. So what they're saying is, if it weren't for Aragorn's rousing speech, Theoden might have had some doubts and just fallen into defeatism and not ridden out one last time. And if it hadn't been for Merry and Pippin tricking Treebeard into taking them to the edge of the forest and thinking that Treebeard wouldn't get aroused. Whereas in the book verse, Theoden, King, and Treebeard get to have a lot more agency, and they don't have to be herded in the same way. So it's a bit more respectful of them as people, I think.
Yeah, he's made into a bit of an idiot in the movie anyway. I mean, I guess we talked about it earlier, like how both Gimli and Treebeard both like portrayed by John Rhys Davies as sort of comic relief characters in the film.
Yeah, but it's hard to know why they have to have that vacillation of Theoden in Helm's Deep because, you know, that scene in the movie is already massively long. They don't need to waste another 10 minutes of him going back and forth.
But I think it sort of makes it more powerful the moment when he actually decides to go to the aid of aid of Gondor in the end, because he's sort of like, why should I help them? They didn't help me and all that. And like in the book, it's almost too easy to me, really. It's just like, okay, let's go to these places and like recruit these guys like at the drop of a hat and like march to war.
Okay, I can see that.
But they're not exactly recruiting them, right? Theoden is just reacting to what's already happening in his land, and the Ents are, or it's already said, you know, these stones were on the brink of an avalanche, and, you know, Merry and Pippin are just the trigger. These things were already going to happen, just maybe they would have been a little longer in coming. And Eomer was already trying to ride to the Fords of Isen when he was arrested, right?
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
So these decisions were already happening anyway. They just sort of triggered it. So Eomer and his men, most of his men, are on the Deeping Wall, and along with Eomer are Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. There are many fires burning. Hosts of Isengard are slowly advancing towards the deep now. But suddenly, from the dike below, they hear yells and cries, and it seems that the Orcs are at the breach, and they defeat the rear guard of the riders, and they drive them back to the wall. And suddenly all the Orcs are pouring in from the breach. Now that it's past midnight, the sky is completely dark, and then suddenly in the storm there is lightning, and then suddenly they can see all of the hosts of Saruman standing below them, ready for an attack. The Orcs are coming on, they're firing arrows. The men on the wall are holding back until the Orcs are closer. But as they reach closer, as they come close to the wall, now the men on the wall, they release all their arrows and they start pelting rocks down on the Orcs. But it just seems like, you know, as soon as the Orcs fall, more jump up to take their place. The Orcs and the hillmen they now bring a ram to break down the gate in the wall. Obviously, the men on the top of the wall can't do anything about it because they have shields up. The men below have shields up. So instead, Eomer and Aragorn leave through a postern door and attack them from the side. And they're able to withstand the charge, but they see that the gate has already had too much damage and will fall after if there is a repeated attack. But even as they're returning, some of the Orcs who were just pretending to be dead jump up and attack Eomer. And then suddenly Gimli comes up out of nowhere, and he manages to get rid of the Orcs.
Yay!
That's a great moment. I mean, there's like a dozen Orcs that try to grab Eomer, and Gimli just sort of kills two of them. It says that an axe swung and swept back. 2 Orcs fell headless. The rest fled. It's like that sort of perfect economy of movement. It's just like it's one Orc on the neck, like on the swing, and on the back swing the other beheads it, and like 10 Orcs flee from him.
Yeah, like job done. I love it.
I love that relationship between Gimli and Eomer in general.
There's this one paragraph that I just want to read out that's just amazing. Okay, I'm just going to read this out. Then at last an answer came. A storm of arrows met them, and a hail of stones. They wavered, broke, and fled back, and then charged again, broke, and charged again. And each time, like the incoming sea, they halted at a higher point. It's just beautiful imagery in this all through this battle scene. It's almost like an epic poem.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually think Tolkien writes far better battles than George R.R. Martin. He writes with such precision the tactics. You really feel you're in amongst the action. It's almost cinematic, actually.
And here it's actually, you know, he himself, you know, says it resembles the sea, and it actually does, you know. Even I think they did this really well in the movie as well, you know. Now the Orcs and hillmen have brought grappling hooks, and they're hurling them over the parapet. And the men standing on the wall above are cutting them down, but they can only do so much. They cut down one ladder and then two come up in its place. But suddenly they are distracted by noises from the deep behind them. Orcs have crept in through the culvert from where the icing flows out of the deep, and they've crept in behind the deeping wall. So now suddenly all of the men are distracted in getting rid of those. And obviously Gimli is the first to jump down.
Of course, because Gimli's a total boss.
But
I kind of feel like in the book that Gimli sort of comes up as the sort of hero of the battle. I mean, he seems to be doing the coolest things here.
Oh,
Not
totally.
Not a lot of focus on like Aragorn.
so the orcs, the orcs are easily defeated. The men of Rohan have Gimli help them block up the culvert. As they're standing on the wall, it seems like there's been a lull in the attack, but then suddenly there is a loud crashing sound, and they realize that they have the orcs and the hillmen have some sort of debris from Saruman, and they've blown up part of the wall, and they are just pouring in. Eomer and Gimli disappear in the attack, but Aragorn and Legolas manage to make it back to the Hornburg. Aragorn goes to see the king. He gives him the bad news that they don't really know where Eomer is, but hopefully he's made it back into the caves. The king is now a little doubtful, and he says maybe I've been a little too hasty. But he says that if I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down fighting, and as soon as the dawn comes, we're going to lead charge out. So, and Aragorn says, dawn has ever been the hope of men. And then Aragorn goes and stands above the great gates, heedless of the darts of the enemy, none of which seem to hit him. And, he holds out his hands, and suddenly the orcs are talking to him, and they say, bring out your king, and we're going to kill him. And Aragorn says, the king comes and goes at his own will. The orcs ask Aragorn, what are you doing here then? And Aragorn says, I just came here to see the dawn. And the orcs say, well, it's not going to have any effect on us since we're the Uruk-Hai, and the sun really makes no matter to us. But then,
I love the sort of like the orcs, they're so cute when they're sort of like self-affirming thing all the time. They're like, we don't care about the sun, we are the fighting Uruk-Hai. Yeah, we are the fighting Uruk-Hai, yeah.
I just find it so absurd that in the midst of battle, like Aragorn and the Uruk-Hai just having this little like piss-man conversation with each other, like, I'm here to see the dawn.
I know.
We don't give a shit about the dawn. Fuck off. It's just like you're in the midst of battle. I mean,
yeah, and there's Aragorn is just standing there in a hail of arrows and darts, and none of them hit him. I mean, none of them.
Yeah, he has hero armor on, but also hero hearing, because in the midst of all this chaos, do you really think they can hear banter? I mean, it's just
there is another blast of fire, and the archway on which Aragorn had just been standing collapses, and Aragorn runs back to the King's Tower.
At which point the orcs are probably laughing their asses off.
Where suddenly, even as they are. But even as he's running back, suddenly Helm's horn starts to blow, and the orcs are suddenly terrified because the horn it keeps echoing in the deep, so it just comes back louder and louder. Aragorn goes back, and then he joins the king's charge, and Theoden charges out side by side with Aragorn. And when they charge down the causeway, and they just drive through the hosts of Isengard like a wind through grass. And then from behind them, the men who had retreated to the caves, they joined the charge as well. The orcs flee before them, and suddenly the charge stops, the entire company stops. And they see that the land in front of him, which has been an open dale, is suddenly changed. There is suddenly this huge forest in front of them. And the orcs are stuck between them and the forest. And suddenly, from another direction, Erkenbrand comes up with, Gandalf shows up with Erkenbrand and all of his scattered men that he's managed to gather. And the orcs now have nowhere to go. So some of them are run down by the King Theoden's men and Erkenbrand's men. Some of them flee into the forest and are never seen again.
I have a couple of things I like to just point out. I like when Legolas is asking about where Gimli is, and they're like, we don't know, and he's like, oh no, that's evil news, and Aragorn's like, yeah, but he's okay, he's stout and strong. He's like, no, I just wanted to tell him how many guys I've killed. And then when Aragorn is doing his little parrying thing, I love his line right before he leaves them. I have still this to say. No enemy has yet taken the Hornburg. Depart, or none of you will be spared. Not one of you will be left alive to take back the tidings to the north. You do not know your peril. And it's like they're completely outnumbered, their walls are falling, and he's just like, you better run away, because we're going to kill every last one of you.
It's either very cool or very stupid.
Well, I guess, might as well say it.
I feel stupid. I mean, they didn't know the horns were coming.
Yeah.
I only have one thing, and it's just the fact that I'm always really horrified by whatever happens to the Uruk-Hai when they go into that Hjorn forest. Like, do they eat them? Like, what happens? But I don't think I want to know.
Trap them and bury them.
Yeah, I think they take them with their roots and just crunch them, suffocate them in earth. And
Oh, like Old Man Willow?
yeah, I think it's not pleasant.
Yeah.
That is a horrible way to die.
I think one thing about sort of the battle, I think they totally gloss over in the movies is the sort of psychological aspect of it. Like, sort of the Uruk-Hai are sort of these monsters that keep on going without any fear or anything. And in the book, there's a lot of sort of psychological weapons that they're for of good use here, like the fear of the forest and the horn. Like the orcs are dirty cowards; they just flee from the horn and they flee from the riders.
The orcs flee from Gimli when he comes in and kicks a few, right? I mean.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas in the movies, you're right; they're just this endless CGI, massive, unstoppable robo orcs, aren't they? Yeah.
Which is why they needed the elves.
Yeah.
Oh. I think that's just really when I first saw the movies as a kid, I really liked that because the elves are kind of all graceful and elegant and all that. I mean, I guess it makes sense for the movies to put them in there because at that point they didn't know that they were making more, so they just wanted to see the elves in action, I guess. But I think one of the big themes of the books is that sort of all the mythic races like the elves and the dwarves, they're sort of dwindling and passing away, and there's this kind of conceit that Middle-earth is our world as well, and this is the mythic past and the age of man is approaching, and soon there won't be any fantastical elements left anymore.
I agree. It's important that men win Helm's Deep.
Yeah, it's almost like the elves are saying, if you want it, you're going to have to fight for it.
Yeah. But then again, I mean, there's one half of me that says totally, thematically it doesn't make sense for the elves to be there. But I can't deny when you're watching that movie, that battle, you're so wrapped up in it, and you're standing on the battlements in the rain, seeing this, endless army. When the elves show up, it's just yes! Fuck yes! They came.
But,
so I my head and my heart are really torn. I love it when they turn up and yes, our heroes aren't alone.
But they all die.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad they all die. I mean, keeping Wolf off. You
so
never see
Peter,
them again
at what age did your elf hate start?
Yeah, but even
I think it started on this reread actually, but different versions of the movie. When did they decide to put the elves in? Because they were originally going to have Arwen there as well.
What?
Perhaps, the Arwen was going to be fighting at Helm's Deep beside Aragorn as well.
Yeah,
actually,
you can listen to one of the movie commentaries, which is done by the writers, Philippa Boyens, and forget the name of the other woman. And they say all the way through that the reason why they have the elves show up at Helm's Deep, and they knew that the hardcore fans would hate it, is that they were trying to appeal to people who hadn't read the books either, and they thought that people who hadn't read the books would be why the hell did the elves not give a hand? And the Arwen thing was just to big her up a little bit as a character, obviously. But then they wanted to have a bigger thing of her turning up later.
Maybe it was later on they decided to put the elves in because, as you said, they don't show up after the Deeping Wall, so they're not in the final charge or anything, so I guess they all just got slaughtered.
That in the movie, Rohan is 43 people, so they kind of needed to add it to the numbers.
Yeah, that's totally true.
I guess this is more for the appendices episode, but I really love Helm Hammerhand, his history and all that stuff.
Oh, it's awesome.
Total badass dude.
Yeah, I have this like really cool kind of map book and archaeological building book of Lord of the Rings, of the world of sort of Middle Earth, and the kind of internal archaeology, the kind of the construction of Helm's Deep, I find fascinating as well. So we can definitely have a geek out session on that.
Who was the king who froze to death? Wasn't that Hammerhand, or was that somebody else?
Yeah, I think it was actually. He sort of used to go out in the snow, like without a weapon and stuff, like kill downlandings with his bare hand.
Yeah, he froze to death, didn't he?
Yeah.
Idiot.
Okay.
But you mentioned about the architecture. I actually had the map of Helm's Deep when I was reading this because to keep track of all the stuff. Like,
Yeah, I know. I had to find one as well, but I didn't find a really good one. I needed like a 3D map to just make sense of what was happening.
I'll definitely post a link to the book that I've got because if you're interested in this, it's got all the maps from like the period of the Silmarillion and earlier and all the way forward. So it's really amazing. I'd really recommend.
Okay.
Cool. So moving on. So there's 2 chapters that Lee was going to do, but he emailed me and he's like busy. He's just gone back to college, which are The Road to Isengard and Flotsam and Jetsam. So I'll just very quickly summarize, basically, and then we can move on to the fun stuff, which is the voice of Saruman and Shellfish. So, The Road to Isengard. Éomer, Theoden, Gandalf, Gimli, Legolas and Aragorn all gather on the plain near Helm's Deep after the victory, and Éomer expresses wonder that Gandalf came at just the right time, typical Gandalf. Though the men are weary from battle, Gandalf urges the king to assemble a party to ride with him to Isengard to meet Saruman. Theoden chooses Éomer and 20 riders to accompany them. Gandalf rides in the company of Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli. They sleep in preparation for the journey the next day, and the slain orcs are gathered in the fields. The party sets out for Isengard the next day, passing through a forest of strange trees. Gimli praises the beauty of the caves to Legolas, who prefers the woods, and Legolas is surprised to see eyes amongst the trees, and Gandalf explains that the forest is full of Ents who are not enemies. The riders of Rohan grieve over their slain fellow warriors, whose bodies litter the fields around them. Eventually they reach the Misty Mountains. They sense that the area known as Nun Curunir, or the Wizard's Vale, is burning, and they see a strange black liquid pass over the ground near them. Gandalf orders his men to ignore it and wait until it passes. Riding on for several days, the group finally arrives at Saruman's stronghold at Isengard. They see the great stone tower called Orthanc, where Saruman lies in wait, surrounded by a deep gorge on all sides. Once Isengard was abloom with gardens and orchards, but ever since it's been under Saruman's control, it's been barren and desolate. At the gates of Isengard, Gandalf's group is slightly surprised to find Merry and Pippin lounging around and smoking. It's the first time Theoden has ever seen hobbits, and they're kind of slightly rude to him. After a brief chat, Merry and Pippin deliver the message that Fangorn is waiting to meet with Gandalf on the northern wall, Treebeard, on the northern wall of Isengard. And Gandalf sets out to meet the Ent, accompanied by Theoden. There you go.
I really love the Merry's dialogue here when they first come there. He's like kicking Pippin and going like, "Alas, my companion is overcome with weariness," and kicking him all the language is doing slightly like tongue-in-cheek and comical, but it's also very cool.
Yeah, like they announce themselves with their full names, like, I am Meriadic of House X, it's pretty hilarious.
Hama's death was mentioned in this chapter, wasn't it? Which is so sad.
Yeah, it was true. He was awesome.
And it kind of showed Theoden's loyalty to his people, because he sort of stopped on Hama's grave and he said, Saruman has done me and my house great harm.
I just love the bit where we get when Gandalf is describing Saruman and what he's done to Orthanc, he kind of makes out that Saruman thinks he's been all tricksy, kind of upgrading Orthanc into a sort of a tower of evil, but he doesn't realise that all the tricks are really coming from Mordor, and the phrase Tolkien gives him is, it's a child's model or a slave's flattery, which I think is really clever. Yeah. And then the only other thing I wanted to say is that, when you first meet Merry and Pippin and they're smoking and they're having the food and stuff, and it just seems really cute and funny. And then it's only later that you realise the implications of why there is pipeweed in Orthanc and how far Sharky has stretched his fingers into the Shire. So even the stuff that seems funny can have big implications.
Yeah, you'll have to wait a long, long time for that.
But
the last line of the chapter was kind of cute too. Where they say, "Oh, he's a very polite fellow." When they're talking about the king.
Yeah, it's hilarious. But even the way they're like, it's now under new management of Treebeard. But it's a fairly straightforward chapter, I feel. It's just a bit of calm after the storm and some light relief at the end. A happy reunion.
I like it when the chapter starts and Amer's like talking to Gandalf and he's like, "You come the hour of need unlooked for," and Gandalf is like, "Unlooked for? I said I'd be here." And then and then he's like, "You're mighty in wizardry, Gandalf the White." And he's like, "That may be, but I haven't shown it yet because they think all the trees were because of him."
Oh,
and he's like,
yeah.
"I see the trees too, but I had nothing to do with that."
Yeah. At least he doesn't take credit for stuff that isn't his, so that's cool.
Yeah, Saruman would have been like, "Yep, those trees are mine. I did that."
Yeah, I'm all over that. What else should we talk about in this chapter? Probably just isn't anything, right? I mean, it's like...
We just get the hobbits being hobbity.
Oh, you do get a bit more mercy, though, don't you? Because there's this cool scene where the Dunlanders, and like they've been told by the evil people that the riders of Rohan will be really cruel, but actually they offer them mercy and say, "Look, this wasn't your beef. Go back to where you were, and let's just make peace." And they're like, "Oh wow, these guys are really nice." Okay.
Yeah, the Dunlanders got dealt a pretty much a shit hand because they were living in what is now Rohan before the sort of the guys from near Mirkwood, the Rohirrim came down, and then the Stewards Gondor sort of gave the lands that are now Rohan to the Rohirrim, and
wow, it's like the British in Palestine, isn't it?
Yeah. So I guess it's understandable that they're kind of pissed off.
But I do like that in general. I mean, you get the impression that Theoden, before he felt Grima, would have been a good ruler because he's not vengeful. He's just very, he does good things for good reasons, typically. Okay. On to the next chapter, or has anyone got anything else to...
Don't think we get any more than just like Gimli and Legolas making travel pass. That's not very exciting.
Yeah, exactly. Thank Christ that never became a book. Chapter 9, Flotsam and Jetsam. Gandalf and Theoden leave Isengard to meet Treebeard. Aragorn and his cohort stay behind, are given food obtained by the Ents, which is a welcome food from the orc stuff. And the two hobbits give Gimli some tobacco, which is absolutely hilarious. And Gimli is just, finding this all rather irritating. Pippin actually fills them all in on what's happened to them since they left. So he's telling Aragorn about what happened with Treebeard. And they also, which I think is a really nice touch, is that Aragorn gives them back their knives and the elf brooches. So presumably Aragorn's been carrying these ever since and into battle, which I think is just really either implausible or really wonderful. And then Merry tells them all about the Entmoot and the tree's decision to go into battle. So, okay, they give the Battle of Isengard, which is very important, that they've basically flooded Isengard and all the kind of the flotsam and jetsam. And it's in this chapter, I think, that you get the description of Grima Wormtongue sort of being thrown into the water and like clambering out onto the steps. Or maybe it's the next one, which is quite important. The chapter where, through their descriptions, you genuinely see for the first time the true power of the Ents. Like, up until this in chapters, they've always been very slow and, ooh, don't be too hasty. But through this description, you actually see that these guys have power, and they are... The word Tolkien always uses is perilous. They are perilous creatures.
Yeah, we have this great description of just the Ents tearing down all of Isengard.
Yeah. I've just seen Lord Manderley put a note on this chapter. Ent water is awesome, and I want it. I want it too. I'm only 5'3". That would be very cool. Oh yeah, and he's put, is the battle at Isengard the single greatest part of the movie adaptation? And I would say no, because I think Helm's Deep is way cooler than Isengard.
But the end attack is pretty cool.
I think they're both.
Yeah, I always think of that one Ent that, starts burning and then sticks his head in the water.
Oh yeah, that's so cute. It's true.
Yeah, it's kind of better in the movie how they break the dam and the river just overflows Isengard. In the book they just sort of like gather a bunch of small streams and build like dams themselves and like gather the water. You imagine this takes over hours or something, and then just like they let the water loose there that way. In the movie they just like break the dam that's already there. It's more visual, I guess. But in this chapter we also get sort of more of Gandalf sort of classic passive aggressive stuff, like when he first meets Pippin and Merry again for the first time after Moria. He's just like why are you talking to me? I'm gonna go talk to Treebeard now. Get out of my way. And but you're alive? What? Gandalf? Shut up. More important stuff to do.
Yeah, he's definitely boss in this, isn't he? He just hasn't got time to sort of sit and... But I love that when he's gone off to have a chat with Treebeard, how there's this wonderful description about how Aragorn and Gimli just sit there and they just smoke for a while in silence and chill. And then they decided what they're going to do next. But the idea that they just do take a few moments just to sit in silence and have a smoke.
Okay,
over to you.
On to the voice of Saruman. After catching up and some much-needed R&R, the Fellowship reunites with Gandalf and the King. The party heads towards the Tower of Orthanc to have a chat with Saruman. Gandalf knocks on the door and bids Grima Wormtongue to fetch his master. Saruman arrives onto the balcony and his sorcerer's voice immediately enthralls most of the party. Saruman exerts his power on the might of King Theoden, flattering him and tempting him with promises of peace and plenty. Theoden's riders fall under his sway. King is long silent. Both Gimli and Eomer call Saruman out on his bullshit, and this sort of causes Saruman to momentarily loses cool. After a while, King Theoden finally sort of breaks the spell and rejects Saruman with an awesome speech. We will have peace when you and all your works have perished. You're a liar, Saruman, and a corrupter of men's hearts. You hold out your hand to me, and I perceive only a finger on the claw of Mordor, cruel and cold. What say you to your torches in the Westfold, and the children that lay dead there? When you hang from a gibbet, for the sport of your own crows, I will have peace with you and Orthanc. A lesser son of greater sires am I, but I do not need to lick your fingers. I fear your voice has lost its charm.
That's an amazing speech and
Theoden is awesome.
Really well written, well read. I love that speech.
Thank you. So, any thoughts about this first part here? I had some points of discussion here about what do you guys think is the power in Saruman's voice exactly? I mean, is it like an innate power to all the story? Because it seems pretty dark, really. I mean, contrary to what Ben Kenobi would have you believe, mind control. That's not really a very moral thing to do.
I never thought it was something magical like Ben Kenobi mind control. I always thought it was just pure oratory, and that really Saruman here is the epitome. I always have this theory that he's anachronistic. He's a very modern figure, and that he is just a man. And I know it's not allegory, and it was probably conceived of before Hitler, but this kind of idea that you can just have powerful orators who can grip a nation and say things that underneath are so evil, but they always have the right arguments and the flattery and the charm, and I feel your pain, and I can help you with this, and I can give you that, Theoden King, and, just come with me. And I just think it's pure oratory, personally. And it's just cleverly done.
Well, I think despite the fact that Tolkien despises the idea that any of his works be taken as allegory, I think this definitely has very strong connotations to Tolkien's political views about politicians maybe talking to people and enthralling them and speaking lies to them and all that.
Absolutely.
But I mean, does Gandalf have the same sort of power? I mean, later on he sort of compels Saruman to come back and all that, and we see in the back end he sort of grows more powerful and fearsome when he tells Bilbo to give up the ring and all that, and I think in the Hobbit as well here.
I think that when Gandalf does that stuff, that is more like Ben Kenobi. That is more like pure magic. When he breaks the staff of Saruman and he compels Bilbo. I think that's more magic, whereas I think Saruman's just using basic eloquence, but at a very sophisticated level that it becomes almost evil.
I think a lot of it is it's Tolkien, so words have power. So when people who are powerful say things, they just almost make you believe them. He never actually comes right out and he does lie, but he gives a plausible lie. And then you just kind of believe it a little bit, and then he kind of pulls at that thread and tries to convince you that what he's telling you is the truth.
Exactly. There's always enough of the truth in his logic to make it seem plausible. He says, look, we're going to lose. This guy, everything that you know is true. He has overwhelming numbers. He's gathering forces. He's going to win. So let's just try and deal with him. Everything he says has this inner logic that you can't deny. That's the danger of it. Everything Saruman says has a lot more sense in it than Aragorn standing in front of overwhelmingly large numbers of orcs and saying, you guys are all going to get screwed, right?
Is it like a kind of an argument between cynicism and idealism then? Kind of Saruman is a cynic that's sort of telling you cut your losses here and ally with me or something.
Absolutely. It's there's greater courage. in doing that.
All right, some other questions I had. Do you think that Theoden was ever in danger of falling under Saruman's way, even here?
Yes, I often wonder if Éomer hadn't been, cut the shit, whether Theoden might have been falling back under the trance. Because he obviously has the capacity to fall under the trance, because he did once before, so... There's
the line that it says that they didn't know if he was struggling with doubt or anger when he was listening. Theoden was silent the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, they're clearly worried, aren't you? And the first time you read it, you are, like, on the edge of your seat thinking, oh, shit.
Yeah, I think this scene is beautifully done in the extended edition of the Return of the King film. Bernard Hill does an excellent job here. He's one of my favorite characters, definitely.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I feel like if Gandalf hadn't been there, things might have gone a lot differently. Like, Éomer would have been speaking out against him, but then, you know, they wouldn't have had, like, Gandalf's calming reason in there.
But Gandalf doesn't, he stays silent throughout the whole thing.
I know he stays silent, but that's part of just, like, him waiting for his moment. But I feel like if he wasn't there, he might not have been able to, like, interject himself later on when he did. I know it started to turn against him when he got all nasty, but I still feel like Saruman would have been able to save it if it hadn't been for Gandalf being there.
Waiting for his moment could be like Gandalf's tagline.
Yeah.
Just shows up randomly.
And a lot of the men falter. Just
yeah.
Éomer doesn't. And part like him stepping up and saying something and then Saruman losing his cool, that actually helps to like lose the spell a little bit.
Exactly, because it exposes to Theoden what this guy really is. So if Éomer hadn't been bolshy and Saruman hadn't lost his cool and had just carried on spinning that wonderful language, at what point would Gandalf have stepped in? Because I think Theoden might have fallen. But it's counterfactual history, we'll never know, I guess.
So, why do you think that, I guess Gimli, he is a dwarf and they're sort of resistant to mind domination and all that, but why does Éomer refuse? His hate for Saruman is so strong that he sees through all of it? Or?
Maybe young hot-headedness, maybe the fact that he has been out kind of ranging in the West Emnet and East Emnet and has seen the impact of Saruman's troops raising the land, whereas Theoden hasn't been exposed to it. So maybe he's just a lot more queued up to be angry about what this guy's done.
Maybe it's like
or maybe
some
because
people are corrupted by the ring and some aren't, like you said in the other episode. Maybe it's similar. Like,
Éomer is like Faramir in that regard, you mean?
Yeah.
That makes sense. Because even though, like, Boromir was more powerful person, he couldn't resist the corruption of the ring, whereas Faramir could, and he wasn't quite as high and mighty as Boromir was.
Well, Saruman sort of puts Éomer down later on, like, he calls him, like, says, like, you're a warrior and you shouldn't really meddle in the affairs of kings and stuff like that, like, do what you do best, and that's like swinging a sword and all that, like, and I guess Éomer is, at least on the surface, he seems more like Boromir than Faramir to me.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think Éomer is just a young, hot-headed soldier, but a good guy. I think there's a lot of, you can underestimate the moral resolve of people like that, and just like write them off as sword swingers. I think there's a definite. Because doesn't Tolkien say somewhere that Éomer will make a good king? Like, Tolkien rates Éomer as a decent guy.
He marries like a princess of Dol Amroth or something. Having failed to persuade Theoden, Saruman throws a hissy fit before turning his voice on Gandalf. The spell descends on the party once more. However, once Saruman is done with his pleas, Gandalf laughs in his face and dismisses him as one would a petulant child. Gandalf offers him a last chance to repent, demanding he surrender his staff and the key to Orthanc. Saruman seems to consider the offer, but in the end his paranoia gets the better of him. He tries to slink off, but Gandalf demonstrates the power of his own voice and stops him with a word. Gandalf proves his mastery by formally casting Saruman out of their order and breaking his staff. After he is given leave to go, a disgraced Saruman flees back into the tower. So I guess that's his portion will be Saruman sort of trying to convince Gandalf and Gandalf breaking his staff.
Yeah, which we were never under any doubt about. But I just think the first time I read this, I was quite shocked that Gandalf had that absolute power over Saruman, because he'd so underplayed himself to that point that it was just really awesome when he just showed that, no, I'm now basically kind of the head of the order, so to say, and you're not in it, and boom. You're back.
Yeah, I gotta say, I really love the language of Saruman in this chapter in general, but like especially when he's talking to Gandalf, like about his imprisonment, he's like, I fear that in my eagerness to persuade you, I lost patience. I mean, if I ever imprison someone, that's going to be my excuse.
It's wonderfully well written, isn't it? I love how Tolkien can write. He can write Uglak and Grishnak, the orcs, but then he can do this like tricksy political language, and he can do that almost. It's almost like mentally ill the way that the Saruman goes back and forth between like conciliatory and charming and oleaginous, and then suddenly vicious and capricious. It's amazing that he can do all these voices.
I have something that's not really related to this part, but does Saruman know that Gandalf has a ring, or can he not see it?
But I can't base it on anything in particular. I feel like they've kept them pretty secret, because Gandalf hasn't even really revealed himself with his true powers until this scene, so he might now.
But I know they talk about how you can't like see a ring of power unless you've worn a ring of power or something like that. And I'm wondering if Saruman even knows that Gandalf has a ring. Like when he imprisons him at the top of Orthanc, does he even know that he just imprisoned one of the great rings of power up there?
Probably not. I mean, just as Gandalf doesn't know that he has a Palantir. These guys are pretty secretive.
Well, you don't wear a Palantir on your hand, but yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, and I guess you get that with Frodo and Galadriel, that you can't see the ring unless you're a ring bearer yourself.
Right, so he probably didn't even know he just put a ring of power on the roof of his building.
It's kind of weird how, sort of, I think in The Return of the King we get that Galadriel says that she had hoped that Gandalf would be the head of the White Council, and that Saruman is the head of the Order, even though seems that he's been a shitty guy like all the time he's been in Middle-earth, and Gandalf has always been like the good guy. I mean, I wonder how much that is like retconning that Tolkien did afterwards, or how much of it's like in the original plan.
Yeah, but was Saruman a shitty man the whole time of Middle-earth?
Well, I don't recall one good thing that he ever did.
I'm with him on this one. I can't think of anything either.
His whole thing is that Gandalf, when he was doing things, he was mostly doing outreach of the other nations and just like getting in touch with other cultures. And Radagast was with the animals, but Saruman was researching ring making, and he got really obsessed with it. So I feel like maybe he wasn't always a total tosser, but like it happened really quickly. Just he got corrupted very quickly by his studies and his arrogance. It's kind of similar to Morgoth or Melkor or whatever being like the most talented of the original of the Valar, you would say. It's the same kind of thing. It's like this most talented person becomes the most corrupted because of their arrogance.
Too smart for his own good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that goes back to that sort of theme that's sort of studying sort of dangerous things. I guess that's is it like a Nietzsche quote? That's like, if you stare long into the abyss also stares into you, or something. Well, Gandalf here, he sort of tries to persuade Saruman to turn back to the good side and sort of turn his cloak once again. Do you guys think that Saruman could have done good if he had been persuaded? I mean, he seems to sort of teeter on the edge there, but in the end his paranoia takes over when he thinks that Gandalf is just trying to sort of become the next Sauron or something.
I'm not sure. I mean, he'd been so long in Sauron's confidence and so manipulated through the Palantir. And some of it's just same arrogance and paranoia that took him to Sauron would have made him distrust Gandalf. So, yes, he teeters. And I often used to wonder if Gandalf had spent a little bit more time trying to persuade him, would he have been successful, but I'm not sure. I think character is fate in this regard.
I feel like if he had started to go with him, he would have been making his own plans on the side to leave him as soon as he could.
Yeah, I guess he would have been kind of defanged as well, because Gandalf demands his staff and the key to Orthanc, and he would have only given them back once Saruman has sort of proved himself. So I don't know what he could have done in the war, really.
Well, yeah, I understand that, but if you just look into the history of the evil characters in Tolkien, I mean, they all, they give them another chance, and then they're like, oh, okay, thank you, and then they're really good for a while, and then as soon as they get a chance to go back to evil, they do.
I guess one of the reasons why Saruman didn't want to come down to the tower, that he's really scared of the Ents. I love the fact that he calls them wild wood demons. And in one of the previous chapters it says that I think Quickbeam was really close to catching Saruman at the door.
But then again, Treebeard has respect for Saruman. I mean, he says to Gandalf, I can manage Orthanc, but there's a wizard in there and that needs something specific. You see, he seems to give him a wide berth as well. There's a good, healthy, mutual distrust.
Okay, maybe moving on. So, Grima throws a globe of dark crystal from above. His intended target unclear. The orb is unharmed by the fall. And Pippin picks up the ball, but Gandalf just sort of quickly intercepts him. And then they take their leave from the tower, and on the way out they sort of chat with Treebeard, and Legolas asks like formal permission to come to Fangorn after the war is over on a vacation or something. He asks permission for Gimli as well, and Treebeard is kind of like suspicious at first, but especially when Gimli's axe falls from his belt, and the Ent and the dwarf, they quickly bond over their shared love of slaughtering orcs, and Treebeard invites Gimli to come over. And then they leave Isengard, and they're heading for Edoras, and they make camp for the night, and Pippin can't sleep because he's sort of very fidgety and he's restless, and after a while he sneaks off and steals the Palantir from Gandalf and takes a look in there, and he sees Barad-dûr, and Sauron sort of grasps him and interrogates him, and Sauron mistakenly believes that Pippin is in Isengard as a prisoner of Saruman, and the connection is cut, and Pippin sort of falls into a coma or something, and Gandalf shows his healing abilities there. Actually, at the start of this chapter, it's sort of like, quite bizarrely, even though he's carrying this like crystal ball with him, even as he speaks, Gandalf is wondering how Saruman kept contact with Barad-dûr. I mean, does he not know about the Palantirs?
Well, apparently not. The bigger question is it credible that he doesn't know about Palantirs?
I guess they are quite ancient sort of technology, even predating Gandalf's sort of coming to Middle-earth. Okay, so after they revive Pippin, the stone is revealed to be one of the Palantir, which means like a seeing stone or something, and it's a relic from the time of Elendil, and Gandalf thinks it's too dangerous and gives it to Aragorn because it's basically his birthright, him being the heir of Elendil and all. And it turns out that this time Pippin's curiosity actually helped Gandalf instead of killing him like last time. It's sort of like Gandalf, if he had tried to use the Palantir, he would have revealed himself to Sauron, and now they have a little bit of time left before Gandalf is revealed. As they discuss their next move, a winged Nazgul passes overhead, no doubt heading to Orthanc. This spurs Gandalf into action. He grabs Pippin and rides off. As Shadowfax races over the land, Gandalf mutters to himself, reviewing Ancient Artifacts 101 in his head. They chat a bit about this and that, history, current affairs, geography. Gandalf reveals that they are soon heading, in fact, towards Minas Tirith, where the Hammer of Mordor is about to fall.
You think it's weird that like Gandalf gives us like Palantir 101, but doesn't realize Denethor might have one?
I haven't gotten past the impassable obstacle of the Sam and Frodo chapters of the Two Towers yet, so I don't have many insights into Return of the King yet. So.
Oh, okay.
But I guess
so basically
Denethor...
it's going to be me podcasting with one other person for the next book, because no one can be bothered to read about Shelob.
Well, I've read the first chapter.
No, I'll be there. I don't mind reading because I haven't reread them ever, so I think I should now.
Cool. I already finished it.
Yay! Okay.
I need to give it another reread. It's already forgot.
Okay, so feel free to put your names against chapters then for next time. Anyway, sorry Peter, back to the Palantir.
They're sort of beyond the world, like the technology level of the world, like today in Middle-earth, I guess. They were of the men of Numenor. I mean, Elendil carried them to Middle-earth, but I guess they were forged by an elf, Fëanor, so they're not actually the work of Westernese.
Elves make everything.
Yeah.
They make everything. Jesus. Okay.
But one thing I thought was interesting, that how Orthanc was actually built by the men of Numenor, and it's actually said that its construction is sort of surpasses anything in the world today, that even the Ents can't harm the tower, and it's even more powerful than anything that Saruman could create, even though he's like a very crafty wizard and basically an angel or something.
Which strikes me as a bit implausible, in a way.
Yeah, I didn't really think the men of Numenor were that advanced.
I think it was weird how Aragorn took it. It's just so odd, because he's like, here, will you take this, Aragorn? He's like, he tells him how dangerous it is, and then he's like, oh yeah, dangerous to some people, but not to me, because it's mine. If I were Gandalf, I would have been like, maybe I'll just keep it.
He's a bit, I'm Dany, the Mother of Dragons from Game of Thrones TV show, Dany. Like,
yeah.
I'm entitled, this is my shit.
And then instead of like rebuking it, Gandalf's like, okay, well here you go, my lord.
But just by the way, don't use it.
Yeah, he does, but yeah.
Yeah, the whole scene's really dodgy.
One other thing that I thought was interesting was how Gandalf speculates about how the Nazgul is heading for Orthanc, and he thinks that Saruman may be able to slay its slay his mount or actually trap the Nazgul in Orthanc. I thought that was really interesting, especially in light of the recent Hobbit movies, where it's being like a big point of contention, the tombs of the Nazgul, which isn't canon, that they were sort of sealed away with magic. So I thought it was maybe like Saruman trapping the Nazgul. Could have he like bound it with spells or something? I wonder if that has any sort of precedent.
I guess it's possible he bound Gandalf.
The Balrog in Moria might have been sealed away as well. It's not clear. I mean, they delved too deep and they might have opened its tomb or like something, or it might have been just sleeping there. But I guess it would have been bound there by like forces greater than the wizards.
But again, I have to say, I think this scene with the Palantir and the effects is really well done in the movie. I liked it a great deal.
And they gave Saruman that horrible death where he just fell off onto the wheel.
Yeah, that was like a massive FU to book readers, wasn't it?
Yeah, I don't understand in that scene why Legolas shows Grima. I mean, what's the point of that?
Well, no, isn't it? Because Legolas is about to throw something at one of the company. Like, he does it as defense.
No, I think it's just, I mean, I guess it could be interpreted that he's trying to save Saruman, but Grima is just stabbing Saruman in the back and Legolas shoots Grima. I guess they were just wrapping up loose ends or something.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're not going back to the Shire.
It's a kind of a funny story how Christopher Lee, who I think he was in, is it MI6? The British sort of, during World War I, he was like a spy. And during filming of that scene, he told Peter Jackson that he thought that Peter Jackson's sort of advice was wrong, that that's not the sound that a man makes when he's stabbed in the back. I know that from personal experience.
That's great.
It's awesome.
Oh, dear. Yeah, that's why it just was a shame we didn't see more of him, because he's just an absolute delight. And apparently he took it really badly that he wasn't back in the next film.
I mean, that's probably one of my favorite. I mean, Theoden is probably my favorite character after Boromir dies in the films, so I really like all the scenes, especially in Return of the King, that whole like defiant speech he gives. But I think it's really sucks that they cut that out. I mean, they do go to Isengard at the start of the theatrical release of The Return of the King, but they don't really see Saruman ever again, so that's really sort of egregious to me.
That was like after they showed the whole Shire thing in the Mirror of Galadriel, they didn't go back to it. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, but
I wonder if at some point they did plan to shoot it as an extended scene and just realised at some point they wouldn't have time or money and just then had that weird ending.
Well, they probably had enough endings and didn't want more.
But it's a key part to me, like it's a key part of that Frodo suffers, right? Because he becomes this pacifist, he doesn't take part in the battle, his name isn't on the honour roll, he just helps out the wounded. And so what happens in that Battle of the Shire is key to understanding that Frodo never quite recovers and he's sacrificed so much and he then goes off into the West. Otherwise, the way it plays out in the current movie is, oh, I have a wound that never heals, that sucks, I'm going to go.
yeah, it's sort of, I guess the scoring of the Shire is sort of the payoff for all the character development for Merry and Pippin as well.
Otherwise, they just end up as comic relief. Like, you never see them ascending because, like, you know, they end up as politicians and important people that are credible. And yeah. Oh well. Anyway, mini rant over.
Yeah. I guess we'll get to it, but I like the part in the book where the wind comes up as Saruman's like spirit raises and it blows it away from Valinor.
Yeah, that's amazing. Kind of wraith and then is blown away. But any more on the Palantir, on this book in general? Any thoughts on this book?
This is my absolute favorite part of Lord of the Rings.
With the exception of Faramir, this is my favourite book, definitely. And so much happens.
In a short period of time.
Yeah, in like 10 days, for heaven's sake. I mean, practically the extended edition practically takes 10 days to have the Battle of Helm's Deep. Cool. Well, in that case, I'm going to wrap it up because I've taken enough of all you good folks' time, and just really want to thank everyone for joining. Nadia, Peter, Brett, especially Joanna and Amanda, who are new to Vassals of Kingsgrove podcasting on Lord of the Rings. So really hope that some or all of you will be back for different episodes in the future, and a massive thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Sort of kind of dreading the next episode of Sam and Frodo. I have to read that book, actually. Oh, God.
Yeah, it's like a punishment, isn't it? After this one, to, like this chapter, like these books have so much quotable stuff. I mean, I was sitting there, like I was literally wandering around in my head, like 4 failingers, and yeah, the next book's gonna be tough. So
I've been reading it at a steady pace of like a few pages a week now. So I guess I'll be...
That's not going to cut it, Peter. I was going to suggest that maybe we try and do that book in 2 weeks' time, kind of same time, same place. So, but do you want a little bit longer? Because it's going to take me a good week to edit this in the evening.
No, I think I can make that time.
Okay, cool. Well, I would encourage all of you just to go onto the Google Doc and put your names against chapters. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so take whatever you want. So, yeah, have a great week, guys, and thanks again.